There is a shrine in Tokyo that tourists walk past without knowing what sleeps beneath it. And there is a well inside that shrine that has swallowed more history than any museum on the earth. For half a decade it had been, to Kagome Higurashi, the single door between two worlds. The quiet, fluorescent-lit Tokyo of vending machines and school exams, and the wild, blood and cherry blossom expanse of the Sengoku era, where yokai still walked the roads and a half-demon with silver hair and a foul mouth had somehow, against every reasonable expectation, become the center of her life. It should have been an ordinary crossing. It was not. The Shikon no Tama, whole again, purified again, hers to guard again after so many years of shattering and gathering and bleeding for it, sat around Kagome's neck on its cord as she climbed down into the well's dark throat, Inuyasha's hand steadying her elbow out of habit more than need. Behind her came Shippo, perched on Kirara's back, and behind him Miroku and Sango, hand in hand, the way they'd finally allowed themselves to be after the last great war had ended. It was meant to be nothing, a supply run. Kagome's mother had sent word through the well that there was medicine on the modern side that could save a sick child in the village, antibiotics no herbalist alive in the Sengoku era could conjure. And so they went, the whole strange family of them, because in 5 years none of them had learned to do anything by half measures. The blue light of the well's magic rose around them as it always did, that familiar suspended weightlessness, that half-second where time itself seemed to hold its breath. Kagome had crossed this threshold more times than she could count. She knew its rhythm the way she knew her own heartbeat. This time, the rhythm broke. The blue light did not settle into its usual violet hush. It sharpened, turned a color none of them had a name for, something between miasma and starlight, something that made Miroku's monk training scream a warning, half a heartbeat before his conscious mind caught up. The Shikon Jewel at Kagome's throat began to pulse, not with malice, but with recognition, as though it had sensed, somewhere beyond the walls of the well, a hunger vast enough to answer its own. "Something's wrong," Kagome said, and her voice didn't even have time to finish leaving her mouth before the well's familiar tunnel of time simply tore. It was not an explosion. It was worse, in its way. A silence, a folding, as though the world had taken in a breath it did not know how to let out. Inuyasha's ears flattened against his skull. Sango's hand went white-knuckled around Hiraikotsu's strap, and then the light that had always been blue turned the deep, bruised violet of a wound, and the well's walls stretched away into something that was no longer stone. They did not fall through time. They fell through distance, through something that felt, to Miroku's trained spiritual senses, like the seams of the world itself pulling loose at a place they were never meant to be pulled. They landed hard, on grass instead of shrine floor stone, under a sky the wrong shade of evening. Inuyasha was on his feet before the others had finished blinking. Tessaiga half-drawn, nose working the air with the particular violence of an animal that has just been dropped somewhere it does not recognize. "That's not the shrine," he said, low, unnecessary. Every one of them could see that already. Instead of Tokyo's skyline or the Sengoku era's endless green hills, they stood at the edge of a modest forest, cicadas humming in trees that looked almost like the ones back home, except the air itself tasted wrong on the tongue. Not evil, not corrupted, just foreign, in a way none of them had words for, layered with an energy signature too dense and too varied to be any single thing. "Miroku?" Sango asked, already scanning the tree line for threats out of old habit, Hiraikotsu loosening on her back. Miroku had gone very still, his prayer bead-wrapped right hand pressed flat against his chest, as though checking that the seal on his cursed palm still held. "There is power here," he said slowly. "More of it, and more different kinds of it. than I have ever felt in one place. Yokai energy, but wrong, stretched thin, like something imitating it rather than being it. And beneath that, something with the weight of divinity. Several somethings, overlapping, contesting each other. He looked up, and for the first time in a long while, the monk who had faced down Miroku himself looked genuinely uncertain. I do not know what land this is. Shippo, small and bristling atop Kirara's shoulder, sniffed the air and made a face. It smells like a city, but not our city. There's metal and smoke and something sweet, like flowers that aren't real. Kagome had gone quiet, one hand still curled protectively around the Shikon Jewel, where it hung against her collarbone. It was warm, warmer than it had ever been, even in the presence of powerful yokai, even near Miroku's worst incarnations. It thrummed now like something waking up in a room full of strangers, uncertain whether to announce itself or hide. "The well," she said finally. "It didn't send us back in time. It sent us somewhere else. Somewhere else." Inuyasha's ears twitched toward a sound none of the others had caught yet. Footsteps, unhurried, deliberate, coming from the tree line to the east. Not stealthy, not rushed. The gate of something that had already decided it had nothing to fear from whatever had just torn a hole in the sky above a quiet patch of woods outside a city none of them recognized. "Someone's coming," Inuyasha said, and drew to Saiga the rest of the way, its blade lengthening from a rust-pitted relic into the massive white-fanged sword that had ended demon lords and saved the world more times than its wielder could be bothered to count. "Stay behind me." Kagome did not stay behind him. She never had, not in 5 years, not once it actually mattered. She knocked an arrow instead, spiritual power already beginning to gather pale and pink along its shaft, her stance widening the way her grandfather had drilled into her 100 lifetimes ago, back when she'd thought sacred arrows were only useful for shrine festivals. The figure that stepped out from between the trees was not, by any measure any of them owned, human. He was young-looking, deceptively so. Miroku's senses told him instantly, the way ancient yokai sometimes wore the faces of the barely grown to lull enemies into misjudging them. With hair so pale it caught what little evening light remained like spun frost, and wings. Black wings, folded loosely at his back, feathers arranged with the unhurried confidence of something that had never once needed to hide what it was. His eyes swept over the 6 of them, over Inuyasha's drawn blade, over the arrow trained on his heart, over the small fox child and the great 2-tailed cat beast, and the sealed curse humming faintly in the monk's right hand, with an expression that held no fear at all. Only interest. The particular, unhurried interest of a man encountering a puzzle he intends to enjoy solving. "Well," the winged stranger said, in fluent, unaccented Japanese that somehow still sounded faintly amused, as though the language itself were a joke he was in on. "This is new. Who the hell are you?" Inuyasha snarled, blade angled. "And where the hell is this?" "Azazel," the stranger said, entirely unbothered by the sword pointed at his throat. "Governor General of the Grigori, which is a title that means considerably less to you right now than the fact that roughly 40 minutes ago, every anomaly detection ward my people maintain across the greater Kyoto region lit up simultaneously, in a pattern none of us have logged before, centered on this exact clearing." His gaze drifted, unhurried, to the pendant glowing faint and warm at Kagome's throat, and something in his expression sharpened, not hostile, but suddenly, precisely focused, the way a scholar's face changes when a theory he'd dismissed as impossible turns out to be standing in front of him. "And that," he added, almost to himself, "is not registering as a sacred gear. It's not registering as anything in 3,000 years of Grigori catalog work, which is, I'll be honest with you, the most interesting thing that has happened to me this century." Sango's hand tightened on Hiraikotsu. "He's not human. He's not yokai either. What is he? A fallen angel, Azazel said cheerfully, before anyone else could answer, as though offering the information as a courtesy rather than a threat. There's a longer conversation buried in that phrase. Factions, wars, a rather embarrassing number of treaties. But the short version is, you have just fallen, quite literally, into the middle of a world with devils, angels, and my lot, all of whom have spent the last several thousand years carefully not stepping on each other's toes. And you, his eyes swept the group again, cataloging, weighing, 6 of you, plus one glowing object that predates my ability to classify it, just tore a hole straight through the boundary that keeps our world separate from every other one out there. That doesn't happen by accident. That doesn't happen at all, as far as my research division has ever documented. We didn't tear anything on purpose, Kagome said, arrow still steady, voice steadier than she felt. We were just going through a well we've used 100 times. Something pulled us here. Azazel's gaze settled on the jewel again, and this time he didn't hide his interest at all. Something with that kind of wish-granting signature could do exactly that, if it wanted badly enough to be found by a world that runs on measurable, ownable power. He tilted his head, considering. Or it could simply be an accident of scale. Enough raw spiritual density in one place tends to attract dimensional instabilities, the way enough mass attracts gravity. Either way, he spread his hands, wings shifting slightly with the motion, and for the first time something like genuine caution entered his posture. Not fear, but the recalibration of a very old, very powerful being, deciding not to underestimate something new. I'm not here to fight you. If I wanted a fight, I'd have brought more than myself, and you'd already know it. I'm here because whatever just happened is going to draw attention from parties considerably less patient than me, and I would very much rather have this conversation before the Vatican's exorcists, my own less scholarly relatives, or worse, does. Inuyasha didn't lower to Saiga. That's supposed to make me trust you? No, Azazel said. And for the first time there was real weight under the easy tone. It's supposed to make you understand the situation you're actually in. You're not in danger from me. You may be in considerable danger from several other people who are, right now, feeling exactly what I felt 40 minutes ago. He glanced skyward, briefly, as though listening to something none of the others could hear. And unless I'm very wrong, some of them are already on their way. As if summoned by the observation itself, the evening air shifted. A distant crackle, like static gathering before lightning, somewhere beyond the tree line to the south. Miroku felt it against his skin before he could name it. A second signature, colder than Azazel's, moving with purpose rather than curiosity. That, Azazel said, and for once his easy smile thinned into something more careful, would be devil territory response. Faster than I expected. He looked back at the 6 of them, travel-worn, wary, weapons drawn, standing in a clearing that no longer belonged to the world they knew, and something almost like sympathy crossed his ancient face. Whatever you are, whatever that jewel is, I'd suggest deciding, quickly, whether you'd rather explain yourselves to me, or to whoever's about to walk out of those trees with a demonic circle already half drawn. Kagome's arrow did not waver. Neither, this time, did her voice. We're not explaining ourselves to anyone, she said, until somebody tells us how to get home. Azazel's smile came back, slow and genuinely delighted, the expression of a man who has just confirmed his new favorite theory. Now that, he said, might be the single most complicated question anyone's asked me in a very long time. Behind him, past the darkening tree line, a second light began to bloom, crimson this time, geometric, precise, the unmistakable architecture of a summoning circle unfolding in the open air. Whoever it belonged to was not being subtle about their arrival. Inuyasha's grip tightened on Saiga. Sango shifted her stance to guard Kagome's flank. Miroku's sealed hand curled, instinctively, protectively, over the curse he'd carried his whole life. Because whatever was about to walk out of that crimson light, his instincts told him plainly, it would not be the last stranger this land had waiting for them. The Shikon Jewel, warm and restless at Kagome's throat, pulsed once, hard, like a held breath finally released. Somewhere in the deepening dark, a new kind of story was already beginning to notice them. The crimson light did not explode outward the way fallen angel or yokai magic tended to. It unfolded, a slow, deliberate geometry inscribing itself into the dusk air, runes and interlocking circles blooming layer over layer, until the whole construction hung suspended a few feet above the grass, like a rose made of light and old blood. Miroku, whose entire training had taught him to read the intent behind a working before its shape ever finished forming, felt the difference immediately. Where Azazel's presence had carried the loose, curious weight of a scholar, this new power arrived organized, contained, owned. 6 figures stepped through the light in the ordered fashion of soldiers who had drilled the maneuver 100 times, and at their center walked a young woman with black hair cut precise at the jaw and glasses that caught the last of the evening sun like twin blades. She wore what Kagome absurdly recognized as a school uniform, not unlike her own, back in a Tokyo that felt further away by the second, though the calm, appraising authority in the girl's violet eyes belonged to someone considerably older than her face suggested. Azazel, the girl said, without preamble, without so much as glancing at the 6 travelers standing wary in the clearing. You beat my peerage here by 11 minutes. I'd ask how, except I already know the answer is going to annoy me. Azazel inclined his head with what looked, to Inuyasha's suspicious eye, like genuine if lazy respect. Grigori sensor nets faster than yours on raw anomaly detection. Always has been. You're welcome to file the complaint through the usual channels. I intend to. Sona's gaze finally moved past him, and Inuyasha felt it land on him, on Tsuga still drawn and gleaming in the half-dark, on Sango's readied hiraikotsu, on the arrow still trembling faintly pink-white at the tip of Kagome's drawn bow, and watched something in the young devil's expression shift from irritation to a far more careful calculation. Behind her, the 6 devils who had come through the circle fanned out with quiet, professional discipline, not drawing weapons, but not relaxing either. One of them, a broad-shouldered young man with an easy, watchful stance, kept his eyes locked on Inuyasha's blade, the way a soldier watches an unfamiliar gun. You're not devils, Sona said. It wasn't a question. You're not angels. Your reading is yokai adjacent on 4 of you, human spiritual on 2, and, her eyes flicked, briefly, unmistakably, to the pendant at Kagome's throat, something I genuinely cannot classify at all, which is, for the record, extremely rare and extremely unwelcome in my territory on the same evening. Your territory. Inuyasha's voice came out flat, edged. This is somebody's territory now. We just got dropped here 5 minutes ago, and already there's rules we broke? Everything is somebody's territory, Sona said, not unkindly, but with the crisp patience of a person explaining a law of physics to someone who had, until recently, been unaware gravity existed. This region belongs to Haus Gremory, by treaty, and by right of the girl who lives 3 miles from where you're standing. My family holds the neighboring claim. Between us, the Church holds the Vatican's jurisdiction over exorcism matters. The Grigori hold a research charter that lets Azazel wander wherever he pleases, and irritate everyone about it. And above all 4 of us sit the 3 great powers, who would very much like to know why a dimensional tear just opened in the middle of a quiet residential district, instead of somewhere considerably less populated. Sango's grip on hiraikotsu didn't loosen. We didn't choose where we landed. I believe you, Sona said, and something in the flat certainty of it seemed to catch Miroku's attention more than any threat could have, which is precisely why I'm speaking to you, instead of my peerage's swords doing the talking. An accidental dimensional incursion is a containment matter. A deliberate one is an act of war. I'd very much like to establish, calmly, which one this is, before anyone panics and makes a decision they can't take back. Kagome's arrow had not lowered, but her voice, when it came, carried less hostility than caution. We're not here to start anything. We just want to find a way home. That, Sona said, may be more complicated than you'd like. She studied Kagome for a long moment, not the pendant this time, but Kagome herself. The stance, the steadiness of the draw, the particular quality of the light gathering along the arrow's shaft. That light isn't angelic. It's not devil corrosive. It's not registering as any holy relic in the church's catalog. And it's not a sacred gear signature either. What is that? Spiritual power, Kagome said simply. Priestess training. It purifies corruption, yokai, curses, that sort of thing. She hesitated, then added, with the blunt honesty that had gotten her through 5 years of impossible situations, I don't actually know if it'll work the same way here. I don't know what any of you are, not really. Something about that admission, the plain, unguarded honesty of it, utterly without strategy, seemed to land harder on Sona than any show of force could have. The young devil's shoulders eased, fractionally, and behind her, the broad-shouldered devil at her flank finally let his own stance loosen a degree. A working, unclassified spiritual discipline, capable of purification effects on yokai-adjacent and possibly demonic-adjacent targets, Sona said, half to herself, the cadence of someone already drafting the report she'd have to file later that night. Wonderful. Azazel, I don't suppose your side has a category for this either. None whatsoever, Azazel said, with the delighted tone of a man for whom none whatsoever was the best possible answer, which is why I'd very much prefer nobody starts a fight before my research division gets a proper look at all of this. I'm not proposing a fight, Sona said, a touch of dry irritation returning to her voice. I'm proposing we all behave like reasonable adults. She turned back to the 6 travelers, and there was something almost formal in the way she inclined her head. Not quite a bow, but a deliberate gesture of respect nonetheless. My name is Sona Citri. I hold the neighboring territorial claim to House Gremory, and I am, functionally, the closest thing to local law enforcement you are going to encounter tonight. I would like to know your names, where you believe you came from, and what that pendant is. In exchange, I will offer you what protection my authority extends, which, in this region, is considerable, and I will not lie to you about what that offer costs. Miroku, who had spent a decade reading the true weight behind every bargain offered to him, stepped forward before Inuyasha's temper could answer for the group. A fair opening, he said, inclining his own head with practiced courtesy. Though I suspect you'll forgive us for wanting to understand the shape of the world before we agree to owe anyone anything in it. His violet eyes, calm and measuring, held Sona's without flinching. I am Miroku, a monk. This is Sango, a demon slayer, and Shippo, of the Kitsune. The one with claws bared at your peerage is Inuyasha, half demon, though I'd caution against saying so within reach of his sword. And this, he inclined his head toward Kagome, is Kagome, a priestess, and the pendant you're so interested in is the Shikon no Tama, a jewel that grants wishes, and which has caused considerably more grief throughout its history than any treasure ought to. The name meant nothing to Sona, but the description clearly did. Her eyes sharpened, and beside her, one of her peerage members, a girl with unusually sharp senses judging by the way her nose wrinkled, made a small, involuntary sound of alarm. A wish-granting artifact, Sona repeated slowly, unaffiliated with any faction, unregistered, undocumented, and apparently capable of tearing a hole between worlds strong enough to relocate 6 beings and itself intact. She exhaled, and for just a moment, the composed student council poise cracked into something closer to genuine, weary concern. Do you have any idea what that is going to look like to the Khaos Brigade the instant word gets out? Or to Cao Cao's people, who have spent years hunting exactly this kind of thing? We don't know who those people are, Sango said sharply. And frankly, we've been hunted by worse. If your world wants a fight over this jewel, we've buried better monsters than anything you've got waiting in the wings. I don't doubt it, Sona said, and there was no condescension in the words at all, only a flat, careful assessment, the same tone she might have used cataloging a Longinus. But I'd rather you not have to find out the hard way. Tonight, in a residential clearing 3 miles from a school full of ordinary human children who have no idea any of this exists. She looked between the 6 of them again, weighing, calculating, and finally seemed to reach a decision. I'm not going to demand you come with me. I have no authority to command guests who arrived by accident, and I have no interest in starting a conflict with 6 unknown combatants of unknown ceiling on the same night an unclassified artifact fell into my territory. But I am going to offer you shelter, real shelter, warded, defensible, and the chance to speak with people who might actually be able to help you find a way home. My king will want to be part of that conversation. So, I suspect, will several people considerably less patient than either of us. Inuyasha finally lowered to Sega, though he didn't sheath it. And if we say no, then I wish you luck, Sona said simply. And I hope, sincerely, that whoever finds you next extends the same courtesy I'm extending now. I can't promise that they will. The clearing fell quiet, but for the settling hush of evening insects, and the last fading glow of the closing summoning circle. Kagome lowered her bow slowly, though she didn't release the arrow's tension entirely, and glanced sidelong at Inuyasha, a look the 2 of them had traded 1,000 times over 5 years of impossible decisions, the wordless conversation of 2 people who had learned to trust each other's instincts more than any stranger's promises. We'll come, Kagome said finally. But we're not signing anything. We're not owing anyone anything. We came to see what this world is, not to become part of it. Understood, Sona said, and for the first time, something that might have been respect flickered across her composed face. For what it's worth, I don't think anyone here is under the impression you're the sort of people who'd sign something you didn't understand. That, in this world, already makes you rarer than you'd guess. Azazel, who had been watching the entire exchange with the barely contained delight of a man observing a fascinating new experiment unfold exactly as he'd hoped, finally spoke up. Before we all go trooping off toward Kuo, he said, I'd like 15 minutes with the priestess and her arrows, purely for research purposes, entirely non-invasive, I promise. No, 4 voices said simultaneously. Sango, Inuyasha, Miroku, and Sona, in a rare moment of perfect unity, and Azazel raised both hands in mock surrender, grinning like a man who had expected exactly that answer, and enjoyed getting it anyway. Worth a try, he said cheerfully. Later then, as the group began the walk toward the tree line, Sona's peerage falling into loose formation around the 6 travelers with the careful, non-threatening distance of an honor guard rather than a captor's escort, Miroku found himself walking a moment beside the broad-shouldered young devil who had watched Tsuchiga so intently earlier. Up close, the young man radiated an odd, restless power, a hum beneath his skin like something coiled and hungry, waiting. You've got a strange energy in you, Miroku observed, mild and conversational. The tone he'd long ago learned disarmed strangers faster than any threat. Not devil, not quite anything I recognize. The young man, Issei, one of the others had called him, grinned, sheepish and proud all at once. Sacred gear, he said. Boosted gear. There's a dragon living in my arm. Long story. He glanced at Miroku's right hand, wrapped tight in prayer beads even now, the faint wrongness of the sealed curse humming beneath the cloth in a way that made even Issei's untrained senses prickle with unease. What's that? Miroku's smile thinned, just slightly, the old practiced deflection of a man who had spent a lifetime carrying a curse most people were better off not knowing the details of. A story, he said, for another time. Preferably one where fewer people are listening. Behind them, the last light of the closed summoning circle faded from the grass, and above the clearing, unnoticed by any of them, a second, colder presence had paused mid-flight over the district, silver-white hair catching moonlight, blue eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp interest at the flare of unfamiliar power that had just rippled across a territory that had, until tonight, been entirely unremarkable. Vali Lucifer did not descend. He simply watched, filed the anomaly away with the patient calculation of a predator who preferred to choose his own moment, and turned back toward the horizon, already wondering, with the first real interest he'd felt in months, exactly what 6 unregistered beings, and an artifact powerful enough to tear space itself, might be worth to a Khaos Brigade that thrived on exactly this kind of chaos. The Sengoku era's newest exiles walked on toward Kuo, unaware that the night's true audience had only just begun to gather. Kuo Academy at night was a strange, sleeping thing. Dark windows, silent courtyards, the ordinary hush of a school built for ordinary children who would never know what walked past its gates after dark. Kagome found herself staring at it the way she once stared at her own school, back before the well had swallowed her whole life and remade it into something stranger and better and infinitely more dangerous. There was an ache in that familiarity she hadn't expected. A school uniform, a vending machine humming faintly by the gymnasium, a world that, on its surface, looked exactly like the one she'd been born into, and wasn't, not even slightly, underneath. Sona led them not into the main school building but toward a smaller, older structure set apart from it. A clubhouse, its windows glowing warm gold against the deepening dark, ivy climbing one weathered wall. The Occult Research Club, she said, by way of explanation, with the faint dry amusement of someone who found the name funnier than she let on. Rias Gremory's territory begins here. I'd suggest letting her speak first. She's particular about guests in her own house. The door opened before Sona could knock, and the young woman who filled the doorway looked, for one disorienting moment, like she belonged in a painting rather than a doorway. Crimson hair falling in a heavy cascade past her waist, blue-green eyes that took in all 6 travelers in a single sweeping, unhurried glance, missing nothing. There was a stillness to her that reminded Miroku, oddly, of Sango on the eve of a hunt, the calm of someone who had faced enough danger to stop performing fear for anyone's benefit. Sona told me, Rias Gremory said, that a wish-granting artifact tore a hole in my territory tonight and walked out the other side wearing 6 different faces. Her gaze settled, last of all, on the Shikon Jewel at Kagome's throat, and something flickered behind her composed expression. Not greed, Miroku noted carefully, watching for exactly that. Something closer to wariness, respect even, of the kind one power affords another it does not yet understand. I'd like to hear the truth of it from you directly, if you're willing, and I'd like to offer my home's protection while we sort out what happens next. No obligations attached. I know how that offer usually sounds in this world. I mean it plainly anyway. Behind her, the clubroom held a handful of others whose presence Kagome could feel even before she saw them clearly. A tall, black-haired young woman with sharp, playful eyes and a presence that hummed faintly with contained lightning. A blond young man with the easy, practiced grace of a swordsman. A small, silver-haired girl who watched the newcomers with flat, unreadable golden eyes and the faint twitch of cat-like alertness. A nervous, wide-eyed girl with pale hair who flinched slightly at the sight of Miroku's bound right hand, as though some old instinct recognized a curse before her conscious mind could name it. And a tall, blue-haired young woman with a sword resting easily against her shoulder, studying Tsuga, with the frank, professional interest of one weapon wielder assessing another. "You're staring at my sword," Inuyasha said flatly to the blue-haired girl. "It's a good sword," she said, entirely unbothered by his tone. "I'm Zenobia. I used to wield Excalibur's fragments before the church, and I parted ways over some theological disagreements. I appreciate a well-made blade when I see one. Thanks, I guess." Inuyasha wasn't sure whether to be flattered or suspicious, and settled, as he often did, for both at once. Rias gestured them all inside, and the clubroom, warm and lamplit, felt for one strange moment almost domestic, until Kagome's eye caught the faint, ritual-precise chalk lines set into the floorboards beneath an ornate rug, the unmistakable geometry of a summoning circle, built into the very foundation of the room. "That's your circle," she said. "The one you use to, what, call people into your service?" Rias followed her gaze, and to her credit, didn't dissemble. "Evil peace system," she said. "When a devil dies, or is close to it, another devil can reincarnate them, using a set of chess pieces: pawn, knight, bishop, rook, queen, binding them into a peerage under the king who revived them. It's how most of my world's power structures function. Loyalty, service, family, all folded into a single magical contract." Her eyes met Kagome's, steady and unflinching. "I imagine that sounds strange to you." "It sounds," Kagome said carefully, "like it means you can't actually choose the people around you. Not really. Not without the peace involved." Something in Rias's expression tightened. Not offense, but the particular ache of a truth, landed too precisely by a stranger who'd only just walked in the door. Beside her, the black-haired girl, Akeno, Miroku would later learn, glanced at her king with an unreadable warmth, and the small, silver-haired girl's ears, actual cat ears, Shippo realized with delighted, wide-eyed fascination, tucked half-hidden in her hair, flicked once, sharply, at the comment. "It's more complicated than that," Rias said, and there was no defensiveness in it, only weary honesty. "Some of my peerage were dying when I found them. The peace gave them a second chance at living, not just at serving me. Konako," she nodded toward the silver-haired girl, "came to me running from something far worse than a contract. Asia," the pale-haired girl offered a small, shy wave, "was cast out by the church for the crime of healing a devil, and had nowhere else to go when I found her. The system isn't perfect, but it isn't only chains either. For some of us, it's the first family we ever had." Sango, whose own family had been built from the wreckage of a demon slayer's village and the unlikely loyalty of strangers, turned brothers and sisters in arms, found herself unexpectedly moved by that. "We understand that better than you'd think," she said quietly. "Ours wasn't built by magic contracts. It was built by 5 years of nearly dying for each other. But I don't think that makes it so different in the end." "No," Rias agreed, and something like warmth finally cracked through her careful composure. "I don't think it does." It was Miroku who broke the moment's fragile ease, ever the one to press where the wound ran deepest. "And if one of your peerage wished to leave," he said, mild, curious, deliberately without accusation, "could they?" The silence that answered him lasted a fraction too long. "The contract binds until death," Rias said finally, quiet. "There have been cases, rare ones, of pieces being transferred, or a peerage member released by mutual agreement with the king. But no, not simply by wishing it." Her jaw set. the faint shame of an honest answer she clearly wished were different. It's not a perfect system. I've spent a great deal of my life wondering if there's a better one. I haven't found it yet. Kagome's hand drifted, unconsciously, to the Shikon Jewel at her throat. The artifact that, in the wrong hands, across 5 years of her life, had granted exactly the kind of unbreakable, corrupting binding Rias had just described, and worse. She understood, with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, precisely why a wish-granting jewel walking loose into a world built on binding contracts had made every faction within an hour's flight go rigid with alarm. That's why everyone's so afraid of the jewel, she said slowly. Not because it's dangerous on its own, because in a world like yours, it could undo every leash anyone's ever put on anyone else, or forge new ones stronger than anything you've built. Either way, it breaks the whole system. The room went very quiet. Yes, Rias said, softly. That's precisely why. It was Aquino who finally broke the tension, rising with the easy hostess-practiced grace of someone determined not to let a heavy moment curdle the evening entirely. Well, she said, voice warm and faintly teasing. On the bright side, none of that has to be decided tonight. Tea? She was already moving toward a side table set with a modest kettle and cups, and something in the domestic, deliberately ordinary gesture eased the room's tension more effectively than any diplomatic reassurance could have. Shippo, who had been quietly, delightedly investigating Kaneko's cat ears from a polite distance, finally worked up the nerve to ask the question that had clearly been burning in him since the introductions began. Are you a kitsune too? You've got the ears, but you don't smell like a fox demon. Nekomata, Koneko said, flat but not unkindly, the faintest, almost imperceptible curl of amusement at the corner of her mouth. Cat, not fox. And I'm half, like your friend. She nodded toward Inuyasha, who bristled reflexively at being nodded toward at all. I ain't half anything you'd recognize, Inuyasha muttered, though there was less heat in it than usual. Something in Kaneko's flat, unimpressed manner seemed to have earned a grudging, immediate respect from him that few strangers managed on first meeting. The evening unfolded in fits and starts after that. Cautious questions traded for cautious answers, the slow, wary architecture of trust beginning to assemble itself between two worlds that had, until tonight, had no reason to know the other existed. Kiba, the blonde swordsman, spent nearly 20 minutes in quiet, absorbed conversation with Sango about weapon maintenance and battlefield instinct, the easy camaraderie of two people who had both bled for their skill. Asia, tentative but warm, gravitated toward Kagome with the shy hunger of someone who had spent years being told her healing gift made her dangerous, and found, in a priestess from another world entirely, someone who understood exactly what it meant to carry a power the world feared before it bothered to understand. It was Miroku, inevitably, who noticed what no one else in the room seemed inclined to mention, a careful, deliberate gap in Rias's explanations, a name that had come up twice in passing and been steered around both times. You've mentioned devils, angels, fallen angels, he said, settling his teacup down with practiced, unhurried patience. And you've mentioned once, in passing, something called the Khaos Brigade, with the particular carefulness of people who'd rather not say more about it in front of guests. His violet eyes, calm and unblinking, found Rias's. I suspect that carefulness is not accidental. Rias's expression sobered instantly. It isn't. She glanced at Sona, some silent, weighted agreement passing between them, before she continued. The Khaos Brigade is a coalition, factions who oppose the current balance of power for a dozen different reasons, some noble, most not. Remnants of an old Satan faction, fallen angel extremists. A splinter group calling themselves the Hero Faction, led by a man named Cao Cao, who hunts sacred artifacts and Longinus-class sacred gears, with something close to religious fervor, and at the center of it all, nominally, sits Ophis, a being of such raw, ancient power that most of the world's strongest fighters avoid provoking her at all costs. Rias's blue-green eyes held Kagome's, steady and grave. An unregistered, unclassified, wish-granting artifact appearing in the world tonight is exactly the kind of thing that draws every one of those factions like blood in open water. Cao Cao, in particular, has spent years hunting objects with a fraction of the power your jewel seems to carry. The warmth of the evening cooled, just slightly, at that. Not into fear exactly, but into the sober, familiar weight of a family that had spent 5 years learning to recognize the shape of a coming storm before its first thunder ever sounded. "We've fought worse than a hunting party before," Inuyasha said, low, certain, Tessaiga resting easy, but ready against his shoulder. "Whoever this Cao Cao thinks he is, he can get in line." "I don't doubt your strength," Rias said carefully. "I've felt what that blade can do just standing near it. But I'd ask you to understand something about this world before that line forms, because it will matter to how this ends. Cao Cao doesn't need to beat you in open combat to win. He only needs to find the right leverage, and in my experience, family is very often exactly that." The room's warmth held, but beneath it now ran a current of something colder, the shared, unspoken understanding of 2 worlds' worth of hard-won family, gathered in one lamplit room, already being measured by enemies neither had yet had the chance to meet. Outside, past the clubroom's warm windows, the night deepened over Kuo, and far beyond the edge of Gremory territory, in a place no ward or barrier could reach, a quiet girl, with long black hair and flat gray eyes, tilted her head, as though hearing, faintly, the first note of a song that had not been sung in this world before tonight, and found, for the first time in longer than memory served her, that she was curious enough to keep listening. Far beyond the reach of Gremory wards, in a stretch of abandoned industrial rooftop that Vali team had claimed as one of a dozen temporary safe houses scattered across the Kansai region, Biku was midway through complaining about the vending machine coffee when Vali finally spoke. "There's something new in Gremory territory," he said without preamble, staring out at the city lights instead of at either of his companions. 6 unregistered signatures, 1 artifact reading that doesn't match anything in Azazel's catalog. And believe me, I checked, because I made him tell me himself an hour ago. Biku lowered the coffee can, grinning the way he always did when the word new entered a conversation. New like a long genus nobody's cataloged, or new like something actually interesting. "New like nothing any of us have ever fought," Vali said, and there was no boredom in his voice for the first time in weeks. A rare, sharpening focus that Jean, curled cross-legged on the edge of the rooftop's ledge, noted with quiet interest of her own. "One of the 6 carries a blade that reads as a spatial severance weapon on top of raw physical output, easily rivaling a mid-tier Longinus, in a body that isn't devil, isn't angel, isn't anything Azazel's people have logged in 3,000 years of record-keeping." "And the artifact?" Jean asked, wish-granting, unbound, loose in the world for the first time in, as far as I can tell, its entire existence. Vali finally turned from the skyline, and the hunger in his pale blue eyes was not subtle at all. "Cao Cao's going to want it the instant he hears." "You know that as well as I do. He's not the only one," Biku said, tossing the empty coffee can aside with cheerful disregard. "Ophis is gonna want to look too, once word reaches her. Something powerful enough and foreign enough to tear a hole clean through dimensional space on its own. That's the kind of thing that gets her actual attention, and you know how rare that is." Vali said nothing to that, but something in his stillness confirmed it was already exactly the thought sitting behind his eyes. He was not by nature a patient man where genuine strength was concerned. The White Dragon Emperor's blood in him hungered for worthy opposition the way other creatures hungered for food or sleep. And 6 unclassified beings walking freely into a world that measured everything by rank and category was, to him, the single most interesting sentence he'd heard in months. "We're not moving yet," he said finally, and the note of restraint in it cost him visibly. "Gremory's already got them under her roof, which means Surzex's faction is going to treat any approach as a diplomatic incident rather than a recruitment opportunity. I want to know what that blade actually does before I put myself in its reach. And I want to know," his gaze sharpened, "exactly how deep that wish-granting power really runs before anyone, myself included, decides it's worth starting a war over." Jeanne uncoiled from the ledge, brushing invisible dust from her armored sleeve, expression unreadable as ever. "Cao Cao already knows," she said quietly. "Georg picked up the anomaly reading 20 minutes before Azazel's team did. He's drafting a full briefing as we speak." Something flickered, briefly, across Vali's face. Not quite alarm, but the recalculation of a man who had just realized his window for careful observation had shrunk considerably. "Of course he did," he muttered. "Cao Cao doesn't believe in windows, only doors, and which ones he's already decided to kick down." 3 miles away, in the warm, lamplit safety of the Occult Research Club's second-floor guest rooms, hastily converted from storage space into something resembling comfort, blankets conjured by Aquino's efficient hospitality, Kagome lay awake long after the others had drifted into uneasy sleep, staring at a ceiling that belonged to no world she recognized. She found Inuyasha, unsurprisingly, awake as well, perched on the windowsill, rather than the futon Rias had provided, ears swiveling faintly at every distant sound the strange new world offered, sword resting across his knees, the way it always did, when he refused to fully let his guard down. "You should sleep," Kagome said, settling beside him anyway, knowing full well he wouldn't. "So should you." He didn't look at her, gaze fixed on the unfamiliar city lights beyond the glass, so different from the endless dark of the Sengoku countryside, and stranger still for how ordinary it managed to look from a distance. Streetlights and rooftops, and the quiet hum of a world that had no idea what slept a few streets over. "Feels wrong," he said finally. "Being somewhere I can't smell if trouble's coming from a mile off. Can't tell friend from enemy by scent here. Everything smells like, I don't know, metal and magic and too many different kinds of power, all stacked on top of each other." "You don't trust them," Kagome said. It wasn't quite a question. "I don't trust anybody who offers help before they know what they're getting out of it," Inuyasha said low. "That devil girl, Rias, she's not lying, I don't think. But everybody in that room tonight was measuring us, weighing what we're worth to keep close, or what we're worth to hand over to somebody bigger." His jaw tightened. "Same as always. Same as it ever is, wherever we end up." Kagome was quiet for a moment, watching the same unfamiliar skyline he watched. "Rias said something tonight that I can't stop thinking about," she said finally. "About the jewel. About what it'd mean to a world that runs on contracts and rankings if a wish that strong got loose in it." Her hand drifted, unconsciously, to the pendant at her throat. "We've spent 5 years trying to keep this thing from destroying our world. I don't think that job's over just because we're somewhere new." "Yeah," Inuyasha said, quiet, and for once there was no bravado in it at all. Only the tired, steady weight of a boy who had grown, slowly and unwillingly, into someone who understood exactly what it cost to protect something the whole world wanted to take from you. "I know." Below them, in the clubroom they'd left hours earlier, a single lamp still burned. Rias Gremory sat alone at her desk, a private magic circle communication array humming faintly before her. Her brother's face, crimson-haired, calm, unmistakably powerful even through the flickering projection, waiting on the other end of the connection. 6 unregistered beings and an unclassified wish-granting relic, Surgex Lucifer said, and though his tone remained gentle, the weight beneath it was unmistakably that of a Satan weighing the fate of a kingdom. You understand what this means for the peace, Rias. If word reaches the wrong ears before the 3 great powers can establish an official position. I know, brother. Rias's voice was steady, but her eyes, when she glanced toward the ceiling, toward the guest rooms above, where 6 strangers slept uneasily, in a world that had already begun deciding what they were worth, carried a weight that had nothing to do with politics at all. I've offered them shelter, not obligation. I intend to keep that promise, whatever the council decides is convenient. Surgex was quiet for a long moment, the flickering light of the array casting soft shadows across his composed face. Then I hope, for all our sakes, he said finally, that they're worth the risk you're about to take on their behalf. So do I, Rias murmured, once the connection had faded, staring at the dark clubroom around her. A home built from broken pieces and reincarnated souls, about to be tested by 6 strangers who had never asked to be part of any of it. So do I. Morning in Quo arrived ordinary and merciless, sunlight spilling gold across a school courtyard that had no idea what had slept above its occult research clubroom the night before. Kagome woke to the unfamiliar sound of a bell schedule chiming somewhere across the grounds and, for one disoriented breath, nearly reached for a school uniform that belonged to a life half a world away. By the time the 6 of them gathered downstairs, Aquino had already laid out a breakfast far more elaborate than the circumstances seemed to warrant, and Rias sat waiting at the head of the table, with the composed, deliberate posture of someone about to deliver news she'd spent the night rehearsing. Azazel wants a formal meeting, she said without preamble. Today, at neutral ground, the old Grigori research annex outside the city. He's already cleared it with my brother's office, and with the church's local liaison, which means, whether either of us likes it, this stopped being a private matter, sometime around 3 in the morning. Meaning what exactly? Inuyasha said, chewing with more suspicion than the toast strictly warranted. Meaning the 3 great powers know you exist, Sona said, arriving through the clubroom's side door with the brisk, unhurried efficiency of someone who had clearly been awake far longer than any of them. And an unclassified wish-granting artifact loose in the world for less than a day has already generated 17 separate inquiry requests across 4 factions. I've read them. Most are academic curiosity, 2 are not. Miroku's expression sharpened. Which 2? One's from the church's exorcist division, which wants to know whether your priestess's purification abilities constitute a doctrinal violation of their monopoly on sanctioned holy work, Sona said, dry enough that Kagome couldn't tell if she was joking. The other is a formal request for observation access from someone attached to the hero faction, officially unaffiliated. Unofficially, everyone in this room knows exactly whose desk that request landed on first. The name didn't need saying twice. Rias's jaw tightened, and across the table, Kiba's hand drifted, briefly, unconsciously, toward the hilt of the sword, resting against his chair. Cao Cao, Miroku said, quiet, testing the shape of the name the way he tested the weight of an unfamiliar curse, before deciding how seriously to take it. He won't come himself, Rias said. Not yet. He's patient in a way that should worry you more than if he weren't. But he'll send someone to look, and whoever he sends will be looking specifically for weaknesses he can exploit later, not strengths he needs to respect now. Her eyes moved, deliberate and grave, to Miroku's sealed right hand, resting as it always did against the fold of his robes. Which is why I need to ask you something plainly, before we walk into that meeting. Is there anything among the 6 of you that a hunter of sacred and anomalous weapons would consider irresistible? The silence that followed was answer enough. Sango's hand found Miroku's shoulder, steady, protective, the old instinct of a decade spent watching him carry a curse the rest of the world only ever saw as a weapon. "There is," Miroku said finally, and unwrapped, slow and deliberate, a fraction of the prayer beads bound around his right hand, enough to reveal, at the center of his palm, a small dark void that seemed to swallow the morning light around it rather than reflect it. The air in the room shifted instantly, a faint, hungry pull tugging at loose papers on the table, before Miroku rewound the beads and the sensation vanished as quickly as it had come. "A curse," he said, into the stunned quiet. "Passed down through my family for 3 generations, born of a demon's vengeance against my grandfather. It is a void, a wind tunnel we call it, that will, if fully unsealed, draw in everything before it without discrimination or end, until eventually it draws in me as well. It has killed every man in my bloodline who carried it before their 40th year. I have carried mine 9 years past the point it should have already claimed me, through means I won't pretend to fully understand myself." His violet eyes, steady despite the weight of the admission, held Rias's without flinching. "If your hunter of anomalous weapons values raw, indiscriminate destructive potential above all else, I imagine he will find that palm considerably more interesting than my staff." The table had gone entirely still. Even Zenobia, who had greeted Tasego with professional enthusiasm the night before, looked faintly unsettled. "That's not a sacred gear," Rias said slowly, "but it might as well register as one, to the kind of person who catalogs weapons by potential rather than origin." "I'd assumed as much," Miroku said, "which is why I'm telling you now, plainly, rather than letting your hunter discover it and decide for himself what conclusions to draw." Something in Rias's expression shifted, not fear, but the particular respect one strategist offers another who has just, unprompted, handed over their own greatest vulnerability, rather than let an enemy find it first. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for trusting me with that." "I don't yet," Miroku said, with the faint, disarming honesty that had won him more allies over the years than any flattery could have. "But I trust that a war fought on false footing serves no one, least of all the people I love. Better you know the shape of the danger now than discover it standing beside me in a fight." The Grigori Research Annex sat on the edge of a stretch of forest half an hour from Quo, unassuming from the outside, a converted old shrine building, weathered wood and quiet stillness, and utterly transformed the moment Kagome stepped through its threshold into a space that hummed, floor to ceiling, with layered wardwork and quietly humming instrumentation unlike anything she'd ever seen. Azazel met them at the door with the easy, delighted energy of a man who had clearly not slept and did not care. 6 hours of sleep and 4 cups of coffee since we last spoke, he announced cheerfully, and I have approximately 40 new questions for every one I managed to answer overnight. Come in, Shemhazai's already set up in the observation hall, and I promise, cross my heart, minimal poking. Shemhazai, when they reached him, presented a considerably more sober counterpoint to Azazel's restless energy. An older fallen angel, with the composed, careful bearing of a researcher who had spent centuries learning patience the hard way. He bowed, formal and precise, to each of the 6 in turn, before settling behind a table arrayed with instruments that hummed faintly at the mere proximity of the Shikon Jewel. "I'll be direct," Shemhazai said, once the formalities had settled. "The Grigori have no interest in confiscating your artifact, containing your people, or forcing anything upon you that resembles the evil peace system's obligations. Our interest is purely academic, and frankly, defensive. A wish-granting relic capable of tearing dimensional boundaries represents a category of threat none of the 3 great powers currently have adequate countermeasures for. I would like to understand it well enough to advise my faction honestly on how dangerous that gap actually is. And if you decide it's too dangerous to leave with us, Sango asked, sharp, protective, then I will say so plainly, and you will still leave this room with the jewel in your possession. Shemhazai said, without hesitation. I do not have the authority to seize it, and I would not use that authority if I had it. Knowledge, not confiscation, is the entirety of my request today. It was, Miroku thought, watching the old fallen angel's steady, unhurried sincerity, either the most honest offer they'd received since arriving, or the most patient long game he'd ever encountered. And given the world they'd fallen into, he suspected it might reasonably be both at once. The examination that followed was, true to promise, gentle. Instruments held at careful distance, questions asked rather than powers tested by force. Kagome's own explanations of the jewel's history, given far more weight than any device's readings. It was nearly an hour into the process, the room settling into something almost like comfortable rhythm, when the ward lattice strung across the annex's outer perimeter chimed, soft, precise, deliberate, the particular tone Shemhazai's instruments reserved for an approach rather than an intrusion. That's not one of ours, Azazel said, all traces of lazy humor vanishing from his voice in an instant, replaced by a focus that made the room's temperature seem to drop several degrees. And it's not devil either. The figure that stepped through the annex's outer doorway a moment later moved with the unhurried, deliberate confidence of someone who had long ago stopped needing to announce his own danger. Dark-haired, calm-faced, dressed in practical black that carried none of the ornamentation the others in the room favored. He carried no visible weapon, which Miroku understood instantly, watching the careful, contained economy of the man's every movement made him more dangerous rather than less. Cao Cao, Rias said, and her voice, usually so composed, carried an unmistakable edge of alarm. You weren't cleared for this meeting. I wasn't, Cao Cao agreed, mild, unbothered, his gaze sweeping the room with the same unhurried, cataloging precision Azazel had shown the night before. Except where Azazel's interest had carried genuine scholarly delight, this man's held something colder. Assessment. Inventory. The careful weighing of a merchant pricing goods he had already decided he intended to acquire, one way or another. I apologize for the intrusion. I found myself unable to wait for an official channel, given the circumstances. His eyes settled, last of all, on Miroku's right hand, bound tight in prayer beads, betraying nothing outwardly at all, and something in the man's calm expression sharpened, subtle but unmistakable, the recognition of a hunter who had spent his whole life learning to sense exactly this kind of concealed, indiscriminate hunger, even through the most careful concealment. Interesting, Cao Cao said softly, and though he addressed the words to no one directly, every person in the room understood precisely what and who he was speaking about. I've spent a great deal of my life collecting weapons the world was too afraid to properly wield. I wonder, monk, whether you've ever considered what yours might accomplish, in the right hands, unsealed. The room went utterly still. Sango's stance shifted, immediate and protective, angling herself half a step in front of Miroku without conscious thought. Inuyasha's hand found Tesaiga's hilt, slow, deliberate, unmistakably a warning. Miroku met Cao Cao's gaze without flinching, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of its usual easy warmth, only the flat, grave certainty of a man who had buried enough of his bloodline to that curse to know exactly what it cost. I've considered it every day for 9 years, Miroku said, which is precisely why it stays sealed, and precisely why the answer to whatever you're about to ask me is no, before you finish asking it. Cao Cao's expression didn't change at all. No anger, no disappointment, only the patient, unhurried calm of a man for whom a single refusal had never once been the end of a conversation. "A pity," he said mildly. "But no matter. I find that most weapons come around to their purpose eventually, whether their wielders choose it or the world chooses it for them." He inclined his head, a gesture of courtesy so precise it felt almost mocking, and turned unhurriedly back toward the door. "Shemhazai, Azazel, my apologies again for the intrusion. I look forward to our paths crossing again, under less crowded circumstances." He was gone as unhurriedly as he'd arrived, leaving behind a room that exhaled, collectively, only once the outer ward chime confirmed his departure. "Well," Azazel said finally, into the taut silence, his usual cheerful tone entirely absent. "That went about as well as I feared it might." Shemhazai's expression had gone grim in a way that aged his composed features considerably. "He came to look, not to take," the old fallen angel said quietly. "Which means, for now, he's still deciding whether taking is worth the cost. That won't last." His eyes found Miroku's, steady and grave. "I would advise, monk, that you never again let that hand be seen unsealed by anyone outside people you trust with your life. Cao Cao does not forget what he's decided he wants." Miroku's jaw tightened, and beside him, Sango's hand found his, not for comfort alone, but the old, familiar grip of a partner already recalculating every future battle around a threat that had just, quietly and without a single blow struck, become the most dangerous thing in the room. "Neither," Miroku said quietly, "do I." Outside the annex, in the deepening afternoon light, the forest stood undisturbed, ordinary, and utterly unaware that somewhere within its quiet trees, a war that measured its openings in patience rather than swords had just, formally, begun. The old Satan faction did not gather in ruins as legend liked to insist, nor in the blasted wastelands where their founding rebellion had been crushed a generation ago. They gathered, more often than not, in places precisely as mundane as the world they despised. A shuttered textile warehouse on the edge of Underworld's industrial district. Dust-caked machinery, standing silent witness to a meeting that would have unsettled even the current Satans, had any of them known it was taking place. Diehauser Belial did not attend such gatherings often. His loyalties, whatever their private complications, sat with the current regime rather than its would-be usurpers. But the woman who did preside over tonight's meeting had once served under the old Lucifer's banner before his fall, and she carried herself still with the bearing of someone who had never once accepted that the old order deserved to lose. "An artifact," she said, addressing the loose, wary circle of remnant loyalists gathered in the warehouse's dim light, capable of granting wishes without limitation, tied to no faction, bound by no contract, appeared in Gremory territory 2 nights ago, and the current Satan's response has been to offer it tea. Her lip curled with old, bitter contempt. This is what 400 years of complacent peace has made of devil ambition. A weapon that could remake the entire hierarchy of power, and Surzex's little sister serves it breakfast. A murmur ran through the gathered remnants. Old soldiers, disgraced nobility, a handful of embittered scholars who'd lost titles and territory in the coup's aftermath and never stopped believing they'd been owed a different outcome. "You're proposing we take it," one of them said, more statement than question. "I'm proposing," she said, "that we do what the current regime lacks the spine to consider. A wish unbound by contract, wielded by someone with the will to actually use it, could restore everything this faction lost. Could remake the evil peace hierarchy entirely. Could give true-blood devils dominion the old Satans always intended. Instead of this soft, treaty-choked peace Surzex has let fester for a century." Her eyes swept the circle, hard and hungry. "The only question is whether any of you still have the will for it." or whether 400 years of hiding has bled that out of you along with everything else. The silence that answered her was not unanimous agreement. Several of the older loyalists exchanged uneasy glances, old caution warring visibly with old grievance. But neither was it refusal. In a war fought as much in whispers as in open combat, that silence, uncertain as it was, would prove to matter a great deal more than anyone in that dusty warehouse yet understood. Sango noticed it first. The way Kagome had begun, almost unconsciously, to withdraw from the group's easy evening rhythm, spending longer stretches alone, with the jewel cradled in her palms, her expression drawn tight with something that hadn't been there before Cao Cao's visit to the annex. She found her on the clubroom's small balcony 2 evenings later, moonlight catching the pendant's faint, restless glow as Kagome turned it slowly between her fingers. "You're not sleeping," Sango said, settling beside her without invitation, the old, easy familiarity of 5 years' hard-won sisterhood. "I keep thinking about what Rias said," Kagome admitted, "about what this thing does to a world built on contracts. I've spent 5 years fighting to keep the jewel from destroying our world, from Naraku, from every demon who wanted its power for themselves. I thought once we finally purified it, once the fighting was over, that part of my life was done." She looked down at the jewel's soft, restless glow. "But it's not, is it? It's just starting again, in a world that doesn't even understand what it's looking at yet. You could destroy it," Sango said, quiet, not quite a suggestion. "Wish it out of existence. You've done harder things." Kagome shook her head slowly. "I thought about that. I think about it every night, honestly. But a wish that big, undoing the jewel entirely, I don't know what that would cost here, in a world I don't understand yet. I don't know what threads it's already tangled into just by existing in this place for a few days." Her grip tightened, protective, around the pendant. "And there's still a sick child back home in the Sengoku era, waiting on medicine we haven't delivered yet. And a modern Tokyo that doesn't know we're missing, and I don't even know if wishing the jewel away would send any of us home at all, or just erase it and strand us here forever." Sango's hand found hers, steady, the same unspoken solidarity that had carried them both through worse. "Then we don't destroy anything tonight," she said simply. "We keep doing what we've always done. We protect each other. We figure out the rules of whatever new battlefield we've landed on, and we make the people who want to take that jewel from you regret ever deciding you were worth the trouble." Kagome managed, finally, something close to a real smile. "You make it sound simple." "It's never simple," Sango said wry. "It's just familiar. We're good at familiar, even when the enemy changes shape." Below them, in the clubroom's warm light, Miroku had drawn Kiba into a quiet, focused conversation about bladecraft and curse work. The two swordsmen's easy rapport a small, welcome pocket of ordinary companionship, amid everything else pressing in around them. Across the room, Shippo had all but adopted Kaneko as an honorary sibling over the course of a single afternoon. The two of them bent together over a plate of sweets Akeno had set out, trading. Shippo delighted to discover surprisingly compatible fox and cat mischief instincts. Zenobia and Inuyasha had struck up an entirely different rapport, an increasingly competitive discussion of swordsmanship, punctuated by good-natured needling, that Rias, watching from across the room, found herself smiling at, despite the gravity of everything else weighing on her shoulders. It was, for one quiet evening, almost possible to forget that 2 factions had already begun circling, patient and hungry, around the family gathered in that warm, lamp-lit room. Almost. The clubroom's ward chime sounded softly, precise and familiar this time, rather than alarming. Sona's signature, requesting entry rather than announcing an unexpected arrival. She stepped in a moment later, expression carrying the particular weary weight of someone bearing news she'd rather not deliver. "There's been movement in the underworld," she said without preamble, addressing Rias directly. "Old Satan faction remnants, small, disorganized, nothing my intelligence contacts consider an immediate threat on their own. But they're talking about the jewel, openly, which they haven't done about anything in years." Her violet eyes moved, grave, to Kagome. "Whatever this artifact is, it's already reaching further into my world's old grievances than I'd like. I don't think either of us can keep treating this as a quiet, contained situation much longer." Rias's jaw tightened, the warm ease of the evening draining visibly from her posture. "How long before it stops being contained at all?" "Honestly," Sona said, "I don't think it's a matter of if anymore. I think it's a matter of which faction moves first, and how prepared the rest of us are when they do." Kagome's hand found the jewel at her throat again, its familiar warmth suddenly less comfort than warning, and beside her, Inuyasha's ears had already flattened, sharp and alert, toward a threat none of them could yet see, but all of them, in that moment, understood was already, inexorably, on its way. The attack came, as these things so often did, in the space between ordinary moments, not at midnight, not from shadow, but on a bright, unremarkable afternoon 3 days later, while Shippo and Kaneko chased each other across the school's back athletic field in a game that had, over the course of a week, evolved into something resembling genuine friendship. Kirara noticed first. The small firecat's ears pricked sharp in sudden mid-stride, her body tensing into the low, coiled stillness that preceded transformation, and Sango, seated nearby, half watching the children's game, half running maintenance checks on Hirikotsu's binding wraps, was on her feet before the first blade even cleared the tree line. Sango, the warning barely left her throat before the attacker was already among them. Fast, disciplined, wielding a curved sword wreathed in a faint, corrosive shimmer, Sango recognized instantly as something engineered specifically to counter demonic resilience. Not a devil, not, judging by the cold, methodical precision of the strike, an amateur either. Sango's Hirikotsu met the blade in a shrieking arc of sparks, the boomerang's ancient bonecraft holding firm against a weapon clearly built to shatter lesser materials, and in the half-second the collision bought her, she got her first clear look at their attacker, a young woman, blonde hair bound tight beneath a hood, moving with the disciplined, ritual precision of holy combat training. "Jeanne, you're fast," Jeanne said, almost admiring, already resetting her stance for a second strike. "The reports undersold you." "Reports," Sango snarled, already swinging Hirikotsu back around in a tight, punishing arc, "means somebody's been watching us, which means you already know this doesn't end well for you." Across the field, Shippo had swept Kaneko instinctively behind him, small foxfire already crackling defensively at his fingertips, an instinct that would have been almost sweet under any other circumstances, given Kaneko was easily strong enough to defend herself, but which spoke to exactly the kind of unthinking loyalty this new, strange family had already built between two worlds in the space of a single week. Kaneko, for her part, didn't argue the gesture. She simply stepped past him, cat-quick, and intercepted a second attacker, Biku, grinning with genuine delight, as his extending golden staff met her guard with bone-jarring force. "Nice reflexes, kitten," Biku said cheerfully, pressing the assault with the loose, joyful violence of someone who genuinely loved a good fight regardless of which side he was technically obligated to be on. "Bet you're stronger than you look. Bet you talk too much," Kaneko said flatly, and drove a punch into his ribs that sent him staggering back 3 full paces, despite his considerable size advantage. By the time Inuyasha and Miroku reached the field, drawn by Kirara's shrieking transformation into her full battle form, flame trailing from her paws as she bore down on the fight, The skirmish had already sharpened into something considerably more serious than a probing test. A third figure had entered the clearing. Tall, composed, carrying no weapon Sango could immediately identify, though the careful way Kiba, who had arrived alongside Inuyasha, sword already drawn, positioned himself, made clear the newcomer was, if anything, the most dangerous of the three. "Georg," Kiba said, low, tight, Hero Faction's resident magic specialist. "If he's here, this isn't just a probe." Inuyasha didn't wait for further introductions. Tsuga cleared its sheath in a single fluid motion, transforming from battered relic to massive fanged blade in the same breath, and the sheer displaced air of the weapon's activation sent Jean stumbling half a step back from Sango, eyes wide with sudden, genuine alarm. "That's not a normal transformation," she said, sharp, urgent, already retreating toward Georg's position. "That reading just spiked past anything in the briefing. Should have read the briefing closer," Inuyasha snarled, and the wind scar tore across the field in a howling arc of golden light, ripping through the space where Jan had been standing a half-second earlier. She'd thrown herself clear just in time. The attack instead cratering deep, smoking furrows across the athletic field's turf, close enough that even Georg's composed expression flickered with startled recalculation. "Fascinating," Georg said, voice carrying a scholar's fascination even amid open combat, hands already weaving through the beginning shape of a working spatial displacement on top of raw physical force. That blade isn't just a weapon, it's rewriting local physics on impact. "Save the commentary," Miroku cut in, staff planted, prayer beads chiming as he wove a rapid defensive ward around Sango's flank. "And tell me plainly whether your master sent you here to test us, or to take something from us. The answer changes considerably how much mercy you can expect." Georg's composed expression didn't crack, though something in his eyes sharpened with new, careful respect. "Lord Cao Cao wished for a live demonstration of your capabilities," he said, entirely unbothered by the admission. "Combat data, nothing more, today." His working finished forming, a shimmering barrier snapping into place around Jean and Biku both, the practiced defensive maneuver of a team that had clearly drilled retreat protocols as thoroughly as their offense. Which, I should say, we've now thoroughly obtained. A pleasure, truly. We'll be in touch. "Like hell you'll just walk away after that," Inuyasha snarled, already surging forward. But the barrier's edges were already folding inward, a controlled retreat rather than a rout, and by the time Tsuga's next strike landed, it met only empty, smoking turf where 3 Hero Faction operatives had stood a heartbeat earlier. The field fell silent but for the crackle of Kirara's slowly cooling flame and the distant alarmed shouts of Quo Academy's ordinary human staff, already converging on a scene the school's protective barriers would need considerable, hurried magic to explain away before curious eyes saw too much. Sango lowered Hirikotsu slowly, breathing hard, the adrenaline of the sudden fight only now beginning to ebb. "That wasn't an attack," she said, grim. "That was exactly what he said it was, a test." "And we passed," Miroku said quietly, surveying the scorched field with a heaviness that had nothing to do with exhaustion, "which means Cao Cao now has exactly the data he wanted, and precisely no reason left to hold back the next time he decides to move." Rias arrived within minutes, alongside Sona and a visibly furious Akino, the school's protective wards already humming with the hurried, layered work of covering 3 separate instances of collateral damage from human witnesses. It took the better part of an hour to settle the immediate chaos. Memory adjustment charms for the handful of students who'd glimpsed too much, hurried explanations to Quo's faculty liaison, a terse, formal communication dispatched to Sir Zex's office, documenting the incident before rumor could outpace the official record. By evening, the occult research club room's usual warmth had curdled into something considerably tenser. Rias pacing the length of the room with barely restrained fury. Sona seated with the rigid, controlled posture of someone doing complicated diplomatic math in her head. And the 6 travelers gathered close together in the particular, wordless solidarity of a family that had just been reminded, sharply, exactly how much danger their presence had already brought down on people who'd only ever offered them kindness. "This is an act of war," Rias said finally, low, furious. "Hero faction operatives, engaging in open combat on Gremory-protected ground, endangering human witnesses. It's an act of war Cao Cao will deny ever authorized," Sona cut in, weary but pragmatic. "Georg's too careful to have left evidence traceable back to formal hero faction command. We'll lodge the complaint. It won't accomplish anything beyond making our objection a matter of record." "Then what does accomplish something?" Inuyasha demanded, still coiled tight with unspent adrenaline. "Besides sittin' around writin' complaints while they figure out exactly how hard they gotta hit us next time." It was Kagome, quiet until now, who finally spoke into the tense silence. And when she did, her voice carried none of the fear the afternoon's violence might reasonably have earned. Only a familiar, hard-won resolve. "We stop waiting for the next test," she said. "We've spent 5 years reacting to Naraku's moves instead of making our own, and it nearly got people we loved killed more times than I can count. I'm not doing that again." Her hand found the jewel at her throat, steady now rather than anxious. "If Cao Cao wants to know what we're capable of, fine. He's about to find out considerably more than a school field's worth of scorched turf." Rias's pacing finally stilled, and something in her expression, weary fury giving way, slowly, to genuine and unexpected respect, settled into careful consideration. "What are you proposing?" "I don't know yet," Kagome admitted, honest even now. "But I know we're not going to be a target that just sits still and waits to see what shape the next attack takes. We've survived a war before. We know how to fight one on our own terms, instead of somebody else's." Miroku, watching her with the quiet, familiar pride of a man who had spent 5 years learning exactly how formidable the girl beside him truly was, allowed himself, despite everything, a small, grim smile. "Then perhaps," he said, "it's time we stopped simply accepting this world's hospitality and started learning enough of its battlefield to make it genuinely ours to defend." Across the room, Sona's careful, calculating expression shifted into something that might, in a different context, have passed for cautious approval. "That," she said, "is either the best idea anyone's had all week, or considerably the most dangerous one. Possibly both." "In my experience," Miroku said, "those two are rarely mutually exclusive." Outside the clubroom's windows, evening deepened over a Kuo academy that had, in the space of a single afternoon, quietly stopped being neutral, ordinary ground. And somewhere beyond the edge of the school's careful layered wards, Cao Cao reviewed Georg's combat data with the calm, unhurried satisfaction of a man whose plans had just been confirmed to be working exactly as intended. Vali Lucifer did not test people the way Cao Cao did. He'd watched the hero faction's clumsy, if effective, provocation on Quo's athletic field from a rooftop half a mile away, arms crossed, unimpressed by the theater of it even as he'd catalogued every detail of the fight with genuine, hungry interest. That blade, he'd thought, watching Tesega's wind scar tear the turf into smoking ruin, is exactly what I've been looking for. He did not send subordinates to make his approach. 2 nights after the hero faction's test, he came alone, landing without fanfare on the small balcony outside the occult research clubroom in the deep hours of night, when only Inuyasha, restless as ever, sleep never coming easily to him in unfamiliar territory, happened to be awake to receive him. You're either very brave or very stupid, Inuyasha said, already on his feet, Tessaiga's hilt beneath his hand, before Vali had finished settling onto the balcony rail. Showing up alone after what your friends pulled on us. Jan and Biku aren't my friends, Vali said, unbothered, silver-white hair catching the moonlight. They're Cao Cao's people. I run with them out of shared convenience, not shared cause. And I'm not here to fight you. If I wanted a fight, half-demon, you'd already know it. And this conversation wouldn't be happening at all. His pale blue eyes swept over Inuyasha with the frank, appraising hunger of a predator, recognizing genuine strength for the first time in longer than he'd admit. I'm here because that sword of yours put a hole clean through a hero faction defensive barrier 3 days ago, and I have spent every hour since trying to understand exactly what you actually are. A half-demon with a sword, Inuyasha said flatly. Ain't complicated. Everything about you is complicated, Vali said, something almost like genuine amusement threading through the words. You're not devil, not angel, not yokai in any classification my faction has on record, and you're radiating raw output that puts you comfortably in range of ultimate class devils on a bad day. I've spent my whole life hunting worthy fights in a world that keeps running out of them, and then you fall out of the sky. He leaned forward slightly, and for the first time, real intensity replaced the lazy drawl. I want to know what you're capable of at full strength. Not a scouting skirmish. A real fight, when you're ready for it. No factions involved, no politics, no agenda beyond finding out which of us actually wins. Inuyasha's grip on Tessaiga's hilt didn't loosen, but something in his expression shifted. A familiar, half-reluctant recognition. The particular respect a fighter reserves for another, who wants nothing from him but an honest contest. You're not trying to recruit me, he said slowly. Not like that Cao Cao bastard was trying with Miroku. Recruit you for what? Vali's laugh was short, genuine. I don't have a cause worth recruiting for. Ophis wants silence. Cao Cao wants his war against the current power structure. I want to know if there's anyone left in this world, or apparently any world, strong enough to actually push me. That's the whole of my agenda. Half-demon. It's considerably more honest than most offers you'll get here. There was a long, weighing silence, Inuyasha's golden eyes steady on Vali's, the balcony's cool night air settling between them like a held breath. When we're ready, Inuyasha said finally. And not before, and not while my family's still being hunted by your hero faction friends looking over my shoulder. Fair, Vali said, and something in his sharp, hungry expression eased into genuine, satisfied anticipation. I'll hold you to that. He rose, wings unfurling, already half-turned to leave, before pausing, glancing back with something that might, on a less guarded face, have passed for respect. For what it's worth, Cao Cao's going to keep pushing. He doesn't understand people who don't want power for its own sake, and it makes him underestimate exactly how dangerous that kind of person actually is. I'd suggest you use that. Most of the world's biggest fights are won before the first blow lands, by whoever understood the other side's blind spot first. He was gone a moment later, into the dark, leaving Inuyasha alone on the balcony, with a promise he hadn't quite meant to make, and a warning he suspected, uncomfortably, might prove more useful than any weapon. Kagome found him there 20 minutes later, drawn by some instinct 5 years of partnership had honed sharper than words. Who was that? She asked, settling beside him. And why do you have that look on your face like you just agreed to something you're not sure you should have? Guy called Vali, Inuyasha said, still staring at the empty dark where the White Dragon Emperor had vanished. Wants a fight. Just a fight. No politics, no agenda. Nothing hiding underneath it. He shook his head slowly. First honest thing anybody in this whole world's offered me since we got here. Kagome studied him for a long moment, something thoughtful and careful in her expression. "You're going to say yes." "Already did," Inuyasha admitted, with the faint, sheepish honesty he reserved only for her. "Figured you'd yell at me for it." "I'm not going to yell at you," Kagome said, surprising him, "because I think after everything this world's already thrown at us, the tests, the politics, everybody weighing us like we're pieces on somebody's board, an honest fight with somebody who just wants to know if you're as strong as you look, is probably the least complicated thing that's happened to us all week." Inuyasha's mouth quirked, something warm and grateful breaking briefly through his usual gruffness. "Didn't expect you to get it." "I've known you 5 years, Kagome said, settling more comfortably against the balcony rail beside him, the two of them watching the unfamiliar city lights together in companionable quiet. "I always get it. Eventually." Elsewhere in the clubroom, sleep had proven equally elusive for Miroku, who found himself instead deep in quiet, careful conversation with Rias, over a low table spread with maps of the region's territorial boundaries. Rias walking him, patiently and thoroughly, through the layered architecture of devil, angel, and fallen angel jurisdiction, the delicate treaty lines that kept 3 factions capable of ending the world from actually doing so. "You're mapping this the way a general maps a battlefield," Rias observed, watching him trace territorial lines with unusual, focused precision. "I am a general, in my way," Miroku admitted. "Was, at least, by the end of things back home. Naraku didn't leave much room for anything less." He set the map down, meeting Rias's eyes with the calm, weighted seriousness that had first won her genuine respect the night they'd met. "I want to understand this world's fault lines, not to exploit them, but because I've learned, the hard way, that the difference between surviving a war and losing everyone you love in one usually comes down to whether you understood the battlefield before the enemy did." Rias was quiet for a long moment, studying him with something that had shifted, gradually, over the course of the week, from wary hospitality into something closer to genuine partnership. "You're not what I expected," she said finally, "when Sona first told me 6 strangers had fallen through a tier in my territory." "Neither are you," Miroku said, with the faint, warm smile that had disarmed strangers and monsters alike for a decade. "I expected, given everything Sona described about your world's power structures, someone considerably more comfortable with owning the people around her. Instead, I find a woman who spends her nights worrying whether the family she built through obligation actually chose her freely." His violet eyes held hers, gentle rather than accusing. "That's not nothing, Lady Gremory. In my experience, it's rather closer to everything." Something in Rias's carefully composed expression cracked, briefly, into something rawer and more honest than she typically allowed strangers to see. "I worry about it every day," she admitted quietly, "whether the peace gave them a choice or just gave them a debt they've mistaken for one." "Then ask them," Miroku said simply, not with the weight of your worry hanging over the question. "Just ask, honestly, and trust that the people who love you enough to have stayed this long will give you an honest answer in return." He paused, then added, with the particular, hard-won gentleness of a man who had spent years learning exactly how much honesty cost and how much more it was worth, "I promise you, it costs less than you fear, and it's worth considerably more than the silence you've been carrying instead." Rias didn't answer immediately, but later that night, long after Miroku had retired, the clubroom's lamp burned well past midnight as Rias gathered her peerage, one by one, and asked, plainly and without armor, the question she'd carried unspoken for years. The answers, when they came, mattered more to her than any of them would ever fully know. The old Satan faction remnant did not send soldiers first. It sent an offer. It arrived in the form of a formally sealed letter, a genuine, ancient devil legal instrument, complete with the ceremonial binding wax of a bloodline that had once ruled a third of the underworld before the old regime's fall, delivered not to Rias, but directly to the 6 travelers themselves, slipped somehow past every ward the clubroom carried, and left resting, impossibly, on the low table where Miroku had spread his territorial maps the night before. Rias's face, when she read it over Kagome's shoulder, went the color of old ash. To the bearer of the Shikon no Tama, it read, in the formal, archaic script of pre-coup underworld nobility, the House of Baal adjacent nobility extends a formal offer of alliance and sanctuary, unbound by the current regime's compromised treaties. We do not seek to seize your artifact by force, as lesser factions have already attempted. We seek partnership, a wish, freely granted in exchange for power, position, and protection considerably more absolute than a Gremory heir's borrowed goodwill can offer. Consider carefully what a world remade in your favor might look like, before dismissing an offer that will not remain open indefinitely. That's a genuine underworld legal seal, Rias said, quiet and furious, turning the letter over in her hands as though it might bite her. Old Satan faction nobility, remnants of the coup my brother's generation put down. They shouldn't have the resources left to forge something this authentic, let alone deliver it past my wards without triggering a single alarm. Which means, Sona said, arriving moments later at the ward breach alert, expression grim, they're better resourced than any of our intelligence estimates accounted for. This isn't a scattered handful of embittered old nobles anymore. Someone's rebuilding that faction's teeth. Kagome set the letter down carefully, as though it carried a physical weight beyond its parchment and wax. They want the jewel to remake their own hierarchy, she said slowly. Restore whatever power structure got broken when their coup failed. Yes, Rias confirmed. And unlike Cao Cao, who wants the artifact as a weapon, or the church, who'd want it contained on doctrinal grounds, this faction genuinely believes a wish that powerful could restore an entire fallen political order. That makes them considerably more patient, and considerably more dangerous, because they're not hunting a prize. They're hunting a restoration they've spent 400 years believing they're owed. Miroku's expression had gone carefully, deliberately still, the particular stillness Sango had learned, over a decade, to recognize as the calm, before he said something that would reshape the room's entire conversation. There is a version of this offer, he said slowly, that isn't entirely without merit, from a certain angle. If this faction genuinely believes restoring their old order would stabilize rather than destabilize this world, and if Kagome genuinely held the power to grant that wish. Miroku, Sango's voice carried real alarm now. You're not seriously suggesting, I'm suggesting, Miroku said, calm, deliberate, that we understand precisely what we're refusing before we refuse it. Because I suspect this is not the last time someone in this world offers us a wish in exchange for loyalty, and I would rather we decide as a family exactly where our line sits, now, calmly, before the next offer comes wrapped in considerably more pressure than a sealed letter. The room fell quiet, weighing the question with the gravity it deserved. It was Kagome, finally, who answered, steady, certain, the same resolve that had carried her through 5 years of impossible choices back home. The jewel doesn't get used to remake anyone's old order, she said. Not this faction's, not Cao Cao's, not even Rias's, if it ever came to that. I've watched what happens when people try to bend a wish that big toward power, instead of genuine need. It corrupts, every single time, without exception, in ways nobody sees coming until it's too late to undo. Her hand found the pendant, steady rather than anxious. I'm not granting a wish to restore anyone's dominion over anyone else. That's not what this jewel is for, and I won't pretend otherwise just because the offer's dressed up in fancy legal seals. Something in Rias's tense posture eased. gratitude and relief plain on her face, even as the larger threat remained entirely unresolved. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what it's worth, I never doubted that answer. But I needed to hear you say it plainly, given what's at stake." "What happens now?" Sango asked. "When they don't take no for an answer." Sona's expression had already shifted into the sharp, calculating focus of someone drafting contingencies. "Now we escalate our own preparations," she said. "I'll need to formally brief my sister. Seraphal Leviathan doesn't typically involve herself in territorial matters this granular, but an old Satan faction resurgence with actual resources behind it crosses a threshold that demands Mau-level attention, regardless of how much political embarrassment that causes anyone." She paused, weighing something further. "And I think it's time the 6 of you had proper combat integration with our peerages. Not because I doubt your individual strength. I've seen what that sword can do to a defensive barrier. But because whatever's coming next won't be a lone probing test anymore. It'll be coordinated, and coordinated threats are considerably harder to survive alone." The next several days folded into something that felt, despite everything, almost like the ordinary rhythm of home. Training grounds behind the Gremory clubhouse transformed into a makeshift proving ground where 2 worlds' worth of combat discipline began, slowly and sometimes clumsily, to learn each other's rhythms. Sango found herself paired most often with Kiba, the 2 of them running drill after drill, until their exchanges achieved something close to genuine synergy. Hirakotsu's wide, sweeping arcs opening gaps that Kiba's speed and precision punished before an enemy could recover. Kiba's sacred gear-forged blades finding cover in the wake of Sango's brute momentum. "You fight like someone who's buried people," Kiba observed, during a rare pause between rounds, not unkindly. "I have," Sango said simply. "My whole village, once. You get efficient about grief when you've had enough practice at it." Kiba's expression, usually so composed, softened into something rawer and more honest. "I understand that better than most people I've met," he said. "The church experimented on children like me once, trying to replicate holy swords in human bodies. Most of the others didn't survive it. I did, and I spent years afterward not sure whether that made me lucky or just unfinished business the universe hadn't gotten around to." He met her eyes, steady. "I don't say that for sympathy. I say it because you're the first person in a long time who didn't flinch when I mentioned it. Grief doesn't scare people who carry their own," Sango said, quiet, understanding settling between them with the particular ease of 2 survivors recognizing a kindred wound. "It's the ones who've never buried anything that flinch." Elsewhere on the training grounds, Shippo had discovered, to Koneko's flat but genuine amusement, that Foxfire illusion techniques and a Nekomata's raw physical instinct made for a startlingly effective combination. Shippo's shape-shifted decoys, drawing an opponent's guard, just long enough for Koneko's blistering speed to close the gap. Asia, watching from the sidelines with the same shy fascination she'd shown Kagome from their first meeting, finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had clearly been building in her for days. "You're healing," she said to Kagome, during a quiet break in the training. "The purification power in your arrows. Does it work the same way mine does?" Twilight healing responds to genuine faith, genuine desire to help. I've always wondered if other kinds of holy power work the same way, or if I've just never had the chance to ask anyone who'd actually know. Kagome considered the question with real care, recognizing in it the particular hunger of someone who had spent years being told her own gift made her dangerous rather than blessed. "I think it's less about faith in any specific god," she said slowly, "and more about conviction maybe. Wanting something enough, purely enough, that the wanting itself becomes power. I've purified corrupted yokai, who'd spent centuries consumed by hatred, just by refusing to believe hatred was the only thing left in them worth reaching." She smiled, gentle. Doesn't sound so different from what you're describing. Something in Asia's expression eased, warm and grateful. The particular relief of a lonely gift finally finding kinship. The church excommunicated me, she said quietly, for healing a devil who was dying in front of me. They said helping him made my power corrupted, unworthy of God's grace. Her eyes met Kagome's, steady, despite the old hurt still audible beneath the words. I've spent a long time wondering if they were right. They weren't, Kagome said, immediate and certain. Power that heals doesn't stop being holy just because the person receiving it doesn't fit somebody's rulebook. If anything, I think that's exactly when it matters most. Asia's smile, when it finally came, was small but genuine, the particular, hard-won warmth of someone who had waited a long time to hear that conviction spoken plainly, by someone who actually understood the weight of carrying it. It was Rias who found Miroku alone that evening, seated apart from the others on the training ground's edge, his sealed right hand resting, as it so often did, against his chest, a habit she'd come to recognize as something closer to prayer than mere caution. You've been quiet since the letter arrived, she said, settling beside him. I keep thinking about what Cao Cao wants from me, Miroku admitted, and what this old Satan faction wants from Kagome, and I find myself circling the same uncomfortable thought, regardless of which threat I'm considering. He turned to face her, violet eyes carrying a weight she hadn't seen in him before. Every faction in this world seems to measure a person's worth entirely by what weapon or wish they carry. I wonder sometimes whether anyone here has looked at any of us and seen a person first and a resource second. Rias was quiet for a long moment, the question landing with more weight than she'd expected. I'd like to think I have, she said finally, careful and honest. But I understand why you'd doubt it, given how this world's first instinct, again and again, has been to catalog you before it ever bothered to know you. I don't doubt you, specifically, Miroku said, and something warm broke through his careful gravity. You've earned better than that suspicion this past week. I doubt the world you're trying to protect us within, which is a rather different thing. He paused, then added, quieter. For what it's worth, 9 years carrying a curse that marks me a weapon, before anything else has taught me exactly one useful thing. The people worth trusting are the ones who ask what it costs you to carry it, rather than only what it could accomplish in their hands. Rias's expression, in the fading evening light, carried something unguarded and genuine. Then I hope, she said quietly, that you'll count me among them. I already do, Miroku said, simple and certain, which is precisely why I intend to make sure whatever's coming for this family doesn't cost you or yours anything you're not prepared to pay. Above them, the evening sky deepened toward true dark, and somewhere beyond the edge of close, careful wards, in a shuttered warehouse thick with old grievance and older ambition, the old Satan faction's remnants finished drafting the considerably less patient offer they intended to deliver next, one that would not arrive wrapped in ceremonial wax and formal courtesy at all. The second offer from the old Satan faction did not come as a letter. It came as Koneko, missing from the training grounds at dusk, her communication charm gone silent, and a single scorched playing card-sized talisman left in her place, bearing the same ceremonial seal that had marked the earlier letter, this one considerably less courteous in its phrasing. A wish for a life, it read simply. Bring the jewel and its bearer to the coordinates below by dawn, unaccompanied by devil escort, or the Nikomata dies as an example of how patient we're no longer willing to be. The clubroom that had, for 2 weeks, held something close to warmth and family, went cold and silent in an instant. They took her from inside my territory, Rias said, and for the first time since the 6 travelers had arrived, her composed diplomatic bearing cracked entirely into raw, unguarded fury. crimson power visibly gathering around her clenched fists. Past every ward, every patrol, because someone let them, Sona said grimly, already running diagnostic checks against the clubroom's ward lattice with shaking hands. This wasn't brute force. This was inside knowledge. Somebody in this region's intelligence network is compromised. Or worse, sympathetic. Shippo, who had spent the past 2 weeks building something that had blossomed, quietly and completely, into genuine sibling affection with the missing girl, stood frozen and pale, small fists trembling at his sides. "This is because of us," he said, voice cracking. "Isn't it? They took her because of us." No one answered immediately, because no one could honestly deny it, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any accusation could have. It was Kagome who finally broke it, and when she spoke, her voice carried the flat, terrible calm of someone who had already, instantly, made a decision she knew the rest of the room would fight her on. "I'm going," she said, "alone, like they asked." "Absolutely not." Sango was on her feet immediately, fierce and immovable. "That's exactly what they want. You isolated, unprotected, walking straight into whatever trap they've built." "I know that," Kagome said, steady despite the fear plainly visible beneath her composure. "I know it's a trap. I know going alone is exactly what they're counting on. But Koneko is a child who has nothing to do with any of this, taken because of a jewel that followed me into this world, and I am not going to sit in this room weighing tactics while she pays for a fight that isn't hers." Her hand found the pendant, steady now, resolute. "This is my line. I told you all, back when that first letter came. The jewel doesn't get used to build anyone's dominion, but I never said it wouldn't be used to save someone's life, if that's the actual choice in front of me." "That's exactly the choice they've engineered," Rias said, urgent, "specifically because they know a wish that powerful, granted under exactly this kind of duress, could be twisted into something far larger than a single rescue. You wish Koneko free, and depending on how the jewel interprets that intent, you may end up granting them leverage over considerably more than they're currently threatening." The room fell into another taut, terrible silence, the exact shape of the ethical trap Miroku had warned, days earlier, that this world would eventually spring on them. Not a simple threat to be met with force, a choice with no clean answer at all. Risk a child's life by refusing to negotiate, or risk unleashing exactly the kind of catastrophic, uncontrolled wish this faction had been hunting from the very beginning. It was Inuyasha, characteristically, who cut through the paralysis with blunt, immovable clarity. "Nobody said anything about wishing for anything," he said. "Nobody said anything about going alone either." His golden eyes swept the room, hard and certain. "They want the jewel and its bearer showing up unaccompanied. Fine. Kagome shows up. Rest of us just ain't gonna be visible when she does." Sona's expression sharpened with immediate, calculating interest. "A rescue operation disguised as compliance," she said slowly. "It's viable, but it requires knowing exactly where and how they're holding her, and precision timing considerably tighter than anything we've drilled together." "Then we don't have time to drill it perfect," Sango said, already moving toward Hiraikotsu. "We have time to do it well enough, and trust the rest to instinct." Miroku, quiet until now, finally spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the particular gravity of a man, laying down terms he intended absolutely to keep. "I have one condition," he said, "before any of us moves." He met Kagome's eyes, steady and grave. "If this becomes a fight we cannot win without unsealing what I carry, I will do so, fully, without hesitation, and without waiting for anyone's permission first." His jaw tightened. "I've carried this curse 9 years past the point it should have claimed me. If it finally does so protecting a child who has nothing to do with any of this, I will consider that a fair trade, And I need all of you to understand, now, that I will make that choice without regret if it comes to it. Miroku. Sango's voice cracked, old fear surfacing raw and immediate. I need you to understand it, Miroku said, gentler now, but no less resolute, not to argue me out of it. I've made my peace with this curse's cost a long time ago. I only ask that if it comes to that, you let it be my choice, made freely, rather than a tragedy you spend the rest of your life blaming yourself for failing to prevent. Sango's eyes were bright with unshed tears, but she nodded. Once, fierce and reluctant, the old, hard-won trust of a decade's partnership overriding her fear. If it comes to that, she said, voice rough, I'll be standing right beside you when you make it. The coordinates led to an abandoned underworld transit station on the edge of Gremory territory, repurposed decades ago and forgotten since. Precisely the kind of overlooked, defensible ground a patient, resourceful faction would choose for exactly this purpose. Kagome walked its cracked, dust-choked platform alone, Jewel visible at her throat, every step deliberate and unhurried despite the fear coiled tight in her chest. While behind her, unseen in the station's deep shadows, the rest of her family moved into position with the silent, practiced discipline of people who had done this exact kind of desperate, high-stakes rescue more times than any of them cared to count. The woman who stepped from the shadows to meet her carried herself with the cold, unmistakable bearing of old nobility, fallen and unreconciled to its fall, the same presiding figure who had addressed the warehouse gathering days earlier, though Kagome had no way of knowing that. You came alone, the woman observed, something like satisfaction threading through her voice. Wise. I'd hoped the reports of your family's loyalty weren't exaggerated. Where's Kaneko? Kagome said, flat, unwavering. Safe, for now. Whether she remains so depends entirely on what happens in the next several minutes. The woman gestured, and from the station's deeper shadows, 2 guards emerged with Kaneko between them, bound in restraint sigils that visibly strained against her considerable strength, expression furious rather than frightened. The jewel, the woman continued, and a wish, freely spoken, to restore House Baal's rightful pre-coup dominion across the underworld's southern provinces. Grant it, and the child walks free unharmed. Refuse, and I'm afraid the calculus changes considerably. Kagome's hand tightened around the pendant, and for one long, terrible moment, the entire station seemed to hold its breath. No, she said. The woman's composed expression flickered with genuine surprise. You'd let the child die, for a principle? I'm not letting anyone die, Kagome said, and the calm certainty in her voice carried an edge the woman clearly hadn't anticipated. I'm just not granting your wish to do it. It was the signal the rest of the family had been waiting for. Inuyasha's wind scar tore through the station's far wall in a howling arc of golden light. Drawing the guards' attention in the same instant, Sango's Hiraikotsu swept low and brutal across the platform, shattering the restraint sigils binding Kaneko with a single, precisely calculated strike. Kirara, transformed and blazing, bore down on the second guard before he could recover his stance, and Kiba's blade found the first guard's weapon in a shower of sparks a half-second before Zenovia's own strike drove him fully to the ground. The presiding woman's composed fury broke into something considerably more desperate, hands already weaving the shape of a working powerful enough to level the entire station, until Miroku's staff, planted hard against the cracked platform stone, unraveled a fraction of his prayer beads, the void at his palm's center pulling the working apart mid-formation with a sound like the world briefly, violently inhaling. I did warn you, Miroku said, voice tight with the effort of controlling the curse's hunger, even partially unsealed, that we came prepared for considerably more than a single, unarmed priestess. The woman's fury collapsed, finally, into raw, undignified panic, as the true scope of the ambush became clear. 6 seasoned fighters and a full complement of Gremory peerage reinforcement, arriving now through Rias's own summoning circle in a blaze of crimson light, closing every avenue of retreat at once. "This isn't over," the woman spat, even as Rias's peerage moved to secure her. "The jewel remains loose in this world. Someone will eventually pry it free of your foolish scruples, priestess. If not us, someone considerably less patient." "Maybe," Kagome said, steady, unshaken. Koneko now safely gathered against her side, small and furious and entirely unharmed. "But it won't be you, and it won't be today. That's enough for me." The walk back to Quo, in the deep, exhausted hours before dawn, carried a heaviness none of them fully shook until Koneko, small and uncharacteristically quiet, finally broke the silence herself, tucked close against Shippo's side. "You came for me," she said, flat as ever, but something in her golden eyes carried real, unguarded gratitude. "Even though I'm not really your family, not the way the rest of your group is." "You're wrong about that," Shippo said, fierce and immediate, small hand finding hers. "You've been my family since the first day you let me steal half your sweets without complaining about it. That's basically the whole test." Something in Kaneko's carefully flat expression finally cracked, small and genuine, into something that looked, for the first time since her rescue, almost like a real smile. Behind them, Rias walked in quiet, thoughtful silence beside Miroku, the night's violence and its narrow avoidance of true tragedy settling heavy on both their shoulders. "You didn't unseal it," she said finally. "The curse, even when the fight turned desperate." "A fraction," Miroku admitted. "Enough to unmake a single working, not the whole of it." He glanced at her, something weary but genuine in his expression. "I meant what I said, about being willing to pay that cost fully if it came to it. I'm grateful, more than I can easily say, that tonight it didn't." "So am I," Rias said quietly, and in the deepening dawn light, something unspoken but profound passed between them. The particular, hard-won bond of two people who had each, in their own way, spent the night proving exactly how much they were willing to sacrifice for a family neither had expected to find. The dimensional tear that had brought 6 travelers into a new world had not, it turned out, closed cleanly behind them. Shemhazai found the anomaly first, a faint, recurring instability in the same stretch of forest where the original rift had opened, pulsing at irregular intervals like a wound that refused to fully scar over. He brought the reading to Azazel with the particular urgency of a researcher who had found something his instruments couldn't fully explain, and Azazel, in turn, brought it to the occult research clubroom with none of his usual cheerful ease. "It's not closing," he said, spreading a series of instrument readings across the low table, where, weeks earlier, Miroku had first mapped Rias's territorial boundaries. "If anything, it's stabilizing into something semi-permanent, a thin, degraded echo of the original tier, still bleeding trace energy from whatever's on the other side." Miroku's expression, studying the readings, had gone carefully, dangerously still. "You're certain the readings are consistent with the well," he said, "not simply residual dimensional instability." "I'm certain the signature matches your world's energy profile," Azazel said. "Whether that means the well itself is still partially open, I genuinely don't know. But there's something else." He hesitated, an unusual pause for a man rarely short on words. "There's a second signature threaded through the readings, faint but distinct. Something that reads, as best my instruments can categorize it, as demonic in origin, but not devil demonic. Something closer to your world's yokai profile." The color drained visibly from Sango's face. "Naraku," she said, the name landing in the room like a blade. "It could be Naraku, or pieces of him." He split off incarnations before, left fragments of himself behind even after we thought he'd been destroyed for good. We watched him die, Miroku said, low, urgent, though the careful precision of the words betrayed how thin his own certainty actually ran. We watched his final incarnation dissolve completely, 5 years ago, after the Shikon Jewel was purified. There should be nothing left of him to follow us through any tier, stable or otherwise. Should be, Kagome said, quiet, and the word carried 5 years' worth of hard, bitter experience, with exactly how often Naraku had defied should be before. But we also thought the jewel would never leave the Sengoku era again, and here we are. Azazel's expression had sharpened into genuine, focused alarm. The particular urgency of a scholar realizing his research had just uncovered something considerably more dangerous than academic curiosity. If a fragment of your world's greatest threat followed the jewel through that tier, he said, and if it's had weeks to recover and adapt in a world it has no history with, that's not a contained problem anymore. That's potentially a second, unknown variable loose in a region already destabilized by 2 rival factions, actively hunting the first one. They found the confirmation 3 days later, in the worst possible way. A stray devil hunting party, dispatched to investigate a series of unexplained disappearances on Gremory territory's outer edge, returned with exactly 1 survivor, a young exorcist, barely conscious, babbling in near-hysterical fragments about a shadow that wore other people's faces, that had offered things, whispered promises in voices belonging to people the exorcist had lost years ago, before the screaming started. Miasma-based psychological corruption, Miroku said grimly, examining the exorcist's wounds with the same practiced, weary expertise he'd once applied to countless victims of Naraku's own incarnations back home, preying on grief, on old wounds, offering false comfort before the true attack lands. I've seen this exact pattern more times than I care to remember. It's him, Sango said, voice tight with old, unhealed fury, or something wearing enough of his methods to be functionally the same threat. Rias, studying the exorcist's wounds with her own trained eye, frowned deeply. This isn't devil corruption. It's not angel or fallen angel corruption either. Whatever this is, it's operating entirely outside our world's established threat categories, which means our usual containment protocols may not even function against it. They won't, Miroku said. Naraku's miasma corrupts through despair and temptation, rather than raw physical force. Holy light and demonic suppression wards alike have proven largely useless against it in the past. The only reliable countermeasures we've ever found were spiritual purification. His eyes found Kagome's, and enough raw, combined force to overwhelm his physical form faster than he can regenerate it. Then that's what we do, Inuyasha said, already reaching for Tsuchiga with the particular, focused fury he reserved exclusively for Naraku's name. Same as always. We hunt the bastard down before he gets comfortable enough to build something worse than a handful of missing villagers. It was Rias, surprisingly, who raised the caution the rest of the room hadn't yet voiced. If this threat is genuinely as dangerous and as difficult to contain as you're describing, she said carefully, and it's currently operating in a region already destabilized by hero faction probing and old Satan faction aggression, hunting it alone, without coordinating with the broader factions who have their own resources and territorial stake in this outcome, may not be the wisest approach. Whatever Naraku becomes in this world, adapted to power structures none of us fully understand yet, could prove more dangerous to everyone here than either of the threats we've already survived. You're suggesting we bring this to Azazel and Sona both, Miroku said slowly. Make it a shared operation, rather than a private hunt. I'm suggesting, Rias said, that a threat this world has no established defense against is exactly the kind of situation where pride in handling our own history alone could cost lives that don't need to be lost. Her eyes were steady, genuinely caring, rather than merely strategic. You're not alone in this world anymore, whether you fully believe that yet or not. Let us help carry this one. Something in Sango's fierce, protective posture eased. Fractionally, at that, the particular, hard-won relief of finally hearing an offer of genuine partnership rather than obligation. She's right, she said quietly, glancing at Miroku and Inuyasha both. We've spent 5 years fighting Naraku with just the 6 of us, because we had no other choice. We actually have a choice now. The coordinated hunt that followed unfolded across nearly a week of careful, methodical tracking. Shemhazai's instruments mapping the miasma's spreading corruption pattern, Azazel's scouts pinpointing its likely lair among a cluster of abandoned shrines on the territory's forested edge, Sona's peerage running defensive perimeter to contain the threat's spread, while Rias's own peerage, alongside the 6 travelers, prepared for what all of them understood would be a considerably harder fight than anything the region's rival factions had yet thrown at them. They found it, finally, in the ruins of the oldest shrine, a shifting, half-formed mass of miasma and stolen faces, clearly weaker and less coherent than the true Naraku had ever been, but unmistakably, horrifyingly familiar in its methods, its cruelty, its patient, predatory hunger, for exactly the kind of grief and old wounds this new world's people carried in abundance. It's a fragment, Miroku said, grim certainty settling over him as the thing's shifting form flickered, briefly, into a face Sango recognized with a sharp, painful intake of breath. Her own long-dead brother, Kohaku, wearing an expression of gentle, false comfort that had never once belonged to the boy she'd actually loved. Something small enough to survive dormant in the space between the tear's opening and its stabilization. Not the whole of what we fought, but dangerous regardless, and growing stronger the longer it feeds on a world full of people who've never learned to guard against exactly this kind of corruption. Then we end it, Sango said, voice steady, despite the visible pain of seeing her brother's stolen face again, Hiraikotsu already raised, before it learns enough about this world's grief to become something considerably worse. The battle that followed was, by any measure, the hardest the region's combined forces had yet faced. The miasma thing's shifting, formless nature proving maddeningly resistant to conventional attacks, absorbing and redirecting blow after blow, until Kagome's spiritual arrows, aimed with 5 years' worth of hard-won precision, finally found purchase in whatever passed for the fragment's core, purification like burning through corrupted miasma in searing, brilliant arcs. Rias's own demonic power, combined with the concentrated force of both peerage's sacred gears and blades, drove the weakening fragment back toward the shrine's collapsing center, until finally, cornered and unraveling, it flickered one last time into Kohaku's stolen face, not to taunt this time, but almost, disturbingly, pleading. Even fragments remember fear, Miroku observed quietly, watching Sango's jaw tighten against the sight, without her aim ever wavering. It's the one mercy of hunting something built from stolen grief. In the end, it only ever knows how to beg in the voices it's already taken. Sango's Hiraikotsu met the fragment's collapsing form with a final, decisive strike, and Kagome's last purifying arrow followed a half-second later, and the miasma unraveled entirely into scattered, harmless light, leaving behind only the quiet, exhausted ruins of a shrine that had, for one terrible week, hosted the last echo of a war none of them had ever fully expected to fight again. The walk back from the shrine, in the gathering evening light, carried its own particular hard-won quiet. The region's combined forces exhausted but intact, the threat genuinely ended rather than merely delayed. "That's the last of him," Sango said finally, quiet, uncertain, needing the reassurance despite already half believing it. Isn't it? There's nothing else left to follow us. I believe so, Miroku said gently, though I've learned, the hard way, never to promise certainty where Naraku's concerned. He glanced toward Rias, walking a short distance ahead alongside her own exhausted peerage. Regardless, I'm grateful, more than I've said, that we didn't face this one alone. Rias, overhearing, glanced back with a tired but genuine smile. That's rather the point of family, she said, however it gets built. Ahead of them, Kaneko walked close beside Shippo, the two of them trading quiet, exhausted commentary on the fight with the easy, unguarded comfort of siblings who had, in the space of a single difficult month, become genuinely inseparable. And behind them all, unnoticed in the deepening dusk, a faint, final pulse of miasma light flickered once more among the shrine's scattered ruins before fading, finally and completely, into nothing at all. But far beyond the edge of Gremory territory, in places no ward or hunting party had yet thought to search, other old grievances, Cao Cao's patient ambition, the old Satan faction's wounded pride, and a quiet, curious girl with flat gray eyes who had, at last, decided the noise in this small corner of the world was worth a closer look, continued, each in their own unhurried way, to gather toward a reckoning none of the region's exhausted defenders yet fully understood was coming. Ophis did not announce her arrivals. She simply became present, the way weather became present, and the first anyone in the occult research club room knew of her presence was the sudden, absolute stillness of the room's air. No wind through the open window, no sound from the courtyard beyond, as though the whole world had briefly, quietly, agreed to hold its breath. She sat, when Rias and the others finally noticed her, on the low windowsill where Inuyasha had spent so many restless nights, small, black-haired, gray-eyed, radiating a stillness so absolute it felt less like the absence of danger, and more like danger too vast to register as anything but calm. "You're the wish," Ophis said, without preamble, looking not at Kagome, but at the Shikon Jewel itself, her flat, ancient gaze carrying neither hunger nor hostility, only a curious, weighing patience that unsettled the room considerably more than open aggression might have. "I've been listening to the noise around you for weeks. I wanted to know why." Rias had gone very still, the particular stillness of someone in the presence of something her considerable power could not meaningfully threaten. "Ophis," she said carefully, "we weren't informed you intended a visit." "I don't inform anyone of anything," Ophis said, unbothered, still studying the jewel with the same unhurried curiosity. "I go where the silence I want isn't, to find out why, and then I decide whether to make it quiet again." Her gray eyes finally shifted, settling on Kagome directly. "You could grant a wish that would silence a great deal of noise. Cao Cao's hunger, the old faction's grievance, even this world's careful, treaty-bound quiet, if you wished hard enough in the wrong direction." Her head tilted, faintly curious rather than threatening. "Why haven't you?" Kagome met the ancient being's gaze without flinching, though every instinct in her recognized, plainly, that she was speaking with something that could unmake the room around her without meaningful effort. "Because silence bought that way doesn't actually solve anything," she said. "I've watched what happens when someone tries to force the world quiet with a wish, instead of earning that quiet honestly. It always comes back louder, eventually. Usually with more people hurt in the meantime." Something in Ophis's flat, ancient expression shifted, not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. The particular recalibration of a being who had expected one answer and received, unexpectedly, a considerably more interesting one. "You could have lied to me," she observed, "told me what you thought I wanted to hear. Most beings do, when I ask them things. I don't know you well enough to know what you want to hear," Kagome said honestly. so I figured the truth was safer than guessing. Ophis was quiet for a long moment, the room around her holding its careful, breathless silence, before something almost impossibly, like the faintest ghost of amusement, touched her ancient features. "That's a reasonable strategy," she said. "I may test it again." She rose from the windowsill, unhurried, already half-turned toward whatever quiet corner of the world she intended to seek next, before pausing, her gray eyes settling once more, briefly, on the room at large. "Cao Cao believes I want your jewel," she said, almost conversational. "I don't. I want quiet, and your jewel is currently the loudest thing in this region. If he takes it by force, the noise will only grow worse before it grows quieter again, and I dislike wading through unnecessary noise." Her gaze found Kagome's one final time. "I would prefer you keep choosing whatever makes the smaller amount of noise. It would save me considerable inconvenience." And then, as unhurriedly and inexplicably as she'd arrived, she was simply gone. The rooms held breath, releasing all at once, the ordinary sounds of the evening courtyard flooding back in, as though they'd never paused at all. Azazel, who had arrived midway through the exchange and wisely said absolutely nothing throughout, finally exhaled a long, shaky breath. "I have spent 3,000 years, he said. Very carefully avoiding ever being in a room Ophis decided to sit in. I would like it noted, for the historical record, that this was considerably less catastrophic than every scenario I'd ever imagined. She wasn't threatening us," Rias said slowly, still processing the encounter's strange, unsettling calm. "She was evaluating. The way you'd evaluate weather, deciding whether it was worth carrying an umbrella. That's rather precisely what I am to her, I imagine," Kagome said, some of the tension finally draining from her shoulders. "Whether she's deciding whether to worry about." The days that followed carried, against all reasonable expectation, something genuinely resembling peace. Ophis's brief, strange visit settling into the region like the passing of a storm that had, remarkably, chosen not to break. Cao Cao's hero faction went quiet, its usual patient pressure notably absent for the first time in weeks. The old Satan faction's remnants, their coordinated abduction attempt exposed, and their resources considerably diminished by the failed operation, retreated into the same cautious silence that had characterized them before the jewel's arrival had emboldened them. It was, everyone in the clubroom understood without needing to say it aloud, precisely the kind of false, held-breath calm that preceded something considerably larger. But for a handful of quiet, ordinary evenings, none of them begrudged themselves the chance to simply exist in it. Rias finally made good on the conversation she'd begun with Miroku weeks earlier, gathering her peerage one warm evening and asking, plainly and without armor, whether the family the evil peace system had built for her was one they'd have chosen freely, given the choice all over again. The answers, unanimous and unhesitating, left her quietly, uncharacteristically tearful for the better part of an hour, Akino's steady arm around her shoulders the entire time. Sango and Kiba's training ground partnership deepened into something that neither quite named, but both quietly treasured, two survivors of very different wars finding, in each other's company, a particular ease that had eluded them elsewhere. Shippo formally declared Kaneko his adopted sister, in a small, solemn ceremony, involving a shared plate of Akeno's sweets that Kaneko, despite her flat protests, clearly found more moving than she'd admit. Asia and Kagome spent long afternoons comparing the theology and instinct behind their respective gifts, each finding in the other a kinship neither had known to hope for. And Inuyasha, true to his word, finally met Vali on a deserted stretch of coastline outside the city one moonlit evening, a fight fought entirely on the White Dragon Emperor's honest terms, no factions, no politics, No agenda beyond two powerful, hungry fighters, testing exactly how far the other's strength truly extended. It ended, hours later, in an exhausted, grudging draw that left both combatants laughing, bruised and genuinely delighted, in a way neither had experienced in longer than either cared to admit. "You're stronger than I expected," Vali said, sprawled on the sand beside a similarly exhausted Inuyasha, both of them watching the moon's reflection ripple across the dark water. "I don't say that often. You ain't so bad yourself, Dragon Boy," Inuyasha said, and for once, there was no edge in it at all, only the easy, hard-won respect of two fighters who'd finally found, in each other, exactly the kind of honest measure the rest of this world had proven so reluctant to offer. But peace, in a world this carefully, precariously balanced, was never meant to last long, and 3 nights later, in the deep, quiet hours before dawn, the ward lattice surrounding Quo Academy's careful boundaries lit up all at once, in a pattern none of Sona's instruments had ever recorded before. Not one faction's signature, but 3, converging on the same coordinates in perfect, deliberate, terrifying unison. The alarm reached Rias's clubroom at the ragged edge of night, Sona's voice cutting through the communication array with none of her usual composed precision. 3 separate signatures, she said, breathless, urgent. Hero faction, old Satan faction remnants, and something Grigori adjacent I can't immediately classify, all converging on the training ground's eastern perimeter within the next 4 minutes. This isn't a coincidence. Someone coordinated this. Miroku was on his feet before she'd finished speaking, the old, familiar calculation of a battlefield general already settling over his features. "They've stopped competing for the jewel," he said grimly, "and started cooperating to guarantee one of them gets it. That's considerably worse than 3 separate threats." "Or," Rias said, already summoning her peerage with sharp, economical gestures, "it's a trap disguised as cooperation. Whoever moves first intending to betray the other 2 the moment the jewel's actually within reach." Her crimson power gathered, fierce and ready. "Either way, we don't have the luxury of waiting to find out which." They reached the eastern perimeter within minutes. The training ground's usual quiet transformed into something considerably more ominous. 3 distinct clusters of power converging from separate directions, exactly as Sona's readings had warned. Cao Cao stood at the center of the hero faction's approach, Georg and Jan flanking him, Biko's absence notable and, Miroku suspected, grimly deliberate. From the opposite tree line, the old Satan faction's presiding woman advanced with a considerably larger contingent than her earlier, failed attempt had commanded, clearly having called in reinforcements from whatever deeper reserves her faction still held. And from a third approach, moving with the unhurried, deliberate confidence of someone who had never once needed to rush an entrance, came a figure none of them had yet encountered directly. Tall, composed, radiating the unmistakable cold authority of genuine fallen angel cadre leadership. Kokabil's successor, Azazel muttered, arriving alongside Rias's forces with none of his usual lazy humor, expression tight and grim. Grigori hardliners. I'd hoped that faction had learned its lesson after Kokabil's own disaster, but apparently 3 years wasn't quite enough humility. "You know them," Rias said. "I know the type," Azazel said. "Fallen angels who never accepted the current peace, who believe the old wars should never have ended, and who see an unclassified wish-granting artifact as exactly the kind of leverage that could reignite them." His jaw tightened. "This is precisely the coordinated nightmare scenario I've spent 3,000 years trying to prevent. 3 factions, 3 separate ambitions, 1 contested prize standing at the center of a training ground that had, weeks earlier, hosted nothing more dangerous than sparring drills and Shippo's delighted foxfire games, and now stood poised to become the site of a battle that could, depending on how badly it spiraled, dragged the entire fragile three great powers piece down with it. Kagome's hand found the jewel at her throat, steady despite the fear coiling tight in her chest, and beside her, Inuyasha's grip on Tsuchiga's hilt tightened with grim, focused readiness. "Whatever happens," she said quietly, to the family gathered close around her. Inuyasha, Sango, Miroku, Shippo, Kirara, and now, unmistakably, Rias's peerage standing shoulder to shoulder alongside them. "We don't let any of them walk away with this jewel. Not tonight. Not ever, if we can help it." "Wasn't planning on it," Inuyasha said, low and certain, and stepped forward to meet whatever the night intended to throw at them. Cao Cao's calm, unhurried voice carried easily across the tense space between the three converging factions. "An unusual gathering," he observed, glancing between the old Satan faction's forces and the approaching Grigori hardliners, with something that might, on a more expressive face, have passed for genuine amusement. "I confess, I hadn't anticipated quite this much competition for tonight's demonstration." "There's no competition," the old Satan faction's woman said coldly. "Only the inevitable outcome of a wish this powerful remaining, unclaimed for too long. Step aside, hero, and let true devil nobility handle what your faction lacks the birthright to properly wield." The Grigori hardliner, tall, unnamed as yet, radiating cold contempt for both rivals in equal measure, finally spoke, voice carrying the particular, weary arrogance of someone who considered the entire gathering beneath his true ambition. "Neither of you understand what's actually at stake here," he said. "An artifact capable of rewriting the fundamental balance of power between three factions doesn't belong to whichever hand grabs it first. It belongs to whoever's prepared to use it to finally end this century's cowardly, treaty-choked peace, and restore the old wars to their proper, unfinished conclusion." "You're all wrong," Rias said, stepping forward, crimson power blazing bright and furious around her. "Because none of you actually asked the person who spent 5 years learning exactly what happens when people like you decide a wish belongs to whoever's strongest enough to take it." Her eyes swept the three converging factions with unmistakable, unwavering resolve. "This jewel isn't a prize on a battlefield. It's hers, freely and rightfully. And every one of you is about to learn precisely how expensive that mistake is going to be." The tension that had been building for weeks, Cao Cao's patient hunger, the old Satan faction's wounded ambition, the Grigori hardliners' old unreconciled grievance, all converging now in a single, terrible instant, finally, inevitably, broke. Georg's working came first, a wide, sweeping barrier strike aimed at fracturing the assembled defenders' formation before the fight could properly begin, and Miroku's staff met it head-on, prayer beads chiming as he wove a counterword with the same rapid, practiced precision he'd shown weeks earlier at their very first, far smaller skirmish. Inuyasha's wind scar tore into the old Satan faction's advancing line, forcing their disorganized reinforcements into a scrambling retreat, even as Sango's Hiraikotsu carved a devastating path through their flank. Rias's own demonic power collided directly with the Grigori hardliners' cold, contemptuous strength, crimson and black energy locking in a fierce, evenly matched contest that shook the training ground's very foundations. And in the chaos's center, Kagome stood with her bow drawn, spiritual power gathering bright and fierce along her arrow's shaft, watching three factions tear into each other and her family's defense alike, and understood, with sudden, terrible clarity, that whatever the night's outcome, it would decide considerably more than just the jewel's fate. It would decide, finally and irrevocably, exactly what kind of world this family had chosen to make their stand in. The training ground had become, within minutes, something closer to a battlefield than any of them had trained for, 3 factions worth of coordinated violence tearing across scorched earth. 3 separate ambitions colliding not just with the family defending the jewel, but increasingly, chaotically, with each other. Old grievances and rival hungers proving considerably harder to hold in temporary alliance than any of the 3 factions had anticipated. Miroku felt it first, the subtle, dangerous shift in the battle's rhythm, as Cao Cao, watching the old Satan faction's reinforcements and the Grigori hardliners' forces, both weaken themselves against Rias's determined defense, made the calculated decision every strategist in that clearing had half expected from the moment the 3 factions arrived together. Now, Cao Cao said, quiet and precise, and Georg's next working shifted target entirely, no longer aimed at the defenders, but at the old Satan faction's exhausted flank, a swift, brutal betrayal that scattered their remaining forces in genuine, unprepared panic. He's using us against each other, the old Satan faction's woman realized. Too late, fury and fear warring plainly across her composed features, as her forces broke formation entirely. This was never cooperation. This was an opportunity, Cao Cao finished calmly, already turning his attention, with the same unhurried, patient focus he'd shown from their very first meeting, directly toward Miroku. And now that the competition's thinned itself considerably, I believe it's finally time we discuss that hand of yours properly. He moved with a speed that belied his calm demeanor entirely, true Longinus manifesting in a blaze of holy light, and Miroku barely raised his staff in time to deflect the strike, the impact driving him back several staggering steps across the scorched ground. Miroku! Sango's cry cut across the chaos, Hiraikotsu already swinging back around toward him, even as she fought to hold her own ground against the Grigori hardliners' remaining forces. I'm all right, Miroku called back, though the strain in his voice betrayed exactly how narrowly he'd survived that first exchange. He met Cao Cao's calm, calculating gaze, and understood, with sudden, terrible clarity, precisely what the man had been patiently waiting weeks to accomplish. You engineered this entire converging attack, he said, specifically to isolate me once the other factions had exhausted themselves against each other. I engineered an opportunity, Cao Cao corrected, mild even now, weapon still raised. Whether it succeeds depends entirely on what you're prepared to risk to keep that curse sealed. His eyes carried genuine, unsettling patience. I've spent years hunting artifacts precisely like the one you're carrying, monk. I find I've grown considerably tired of waiting politely for consent. The strike that followed came faster than the first, forcing Miroku's staff up in a desperate block that cracked under the true Longinus's wholly forged edge. And for one terrible suspended moment, it seemed genuinely possible that the promise Miroku had made weeks earlier, full, unhesitating unsealing, if the fight demanded it, was about to become tonight's grim, necessary reality. It was Kagome's arrow that changed the calculation entirely. Loosed with 5 years' worth of hard-won precision, spiritual power blazing bright and furious along its shaft, the arrow struck Cao Cao's weapon at the exact moment his next strike began forming, not disarming him outright, but disrupting the working's focus just enough to buy Miroku the half-second he needed to recover his stance. You've been so focused on my hand, Miroku said, breathing hard but steady, that you forgot the rest of us came prepared to defend it. His staff swept up, prayer beads chiming, weaving a rapid counterword that, for the first time in the exchange, forced Cao Cao to actually retreat a step rather than simply press forward. Across the battlefield, the coordinated 3-faction assault had, in the wake of Cao Cao's betrayal, collapsed into something closer to genuine 3-way chaos. The old Satan faction's scattered remnants fighting as much to escape the hero faction's sudden aggression as to reach the jewel. The Grigori hardliners' forces, sensing the shifting tide, beginning their own calculated retreat, rather than risk being caught between two increasingly hostile rivals. It was in the midst of that chaos that the night's true turning point arrived, not from any of the three factions but from above, in a sudden, absolute stillness that swept across the entire battlefield like a held breath, every combatant's motion faltering in unison, as a small, black-haired figure simply, quietly, became present at the clearing's center. Ophis did not raise her power visibly. She did not need to. The mere fact of her presence, absolute and ancient, brought the entire chaotic battle to a ragged, uncertain halt. Every faction's forces instinctively, involuntarily recalculating the cost of continuing to fight in front of something capable of unmaking the battlefield entirely without meaningful effort. "This is considerably more noise than I asked for," Ophis observed, flat and unbothered, gray eyes sweeping across the scorched, battle-torn training ground with mild, ancient disapproval. Her gaze settled, briefly, on Cao Cao. "I told you, when you first began hunting this artifact, that I had no interest in it changing hands by force. You've chosen to ignore that preference rather more times than I'm willing to continue tolerating." Cao Cao, to his credit, did not flinch, but something in his calm, calculating composure finally, visibly cracked. The particular caution of a man who understood exactly how far outmatched his considerable ambition had just become. "Ophis," he said carefully, "I hadn't anticipated your direct intervention." "Few do," Ophis said, unbothered. "That's rather the point." Her attention shifted finally to Kagome, and something in her flat, ancient expression carried the faintest, unmistakable trace of genuine curiosity. "You kept choosing the quieter path, every time this world offered you a louder one. I find I've grown curious enough about that choice to make sure tonight's noise doesn't undo it." She did not attack. She did not need to. The mere shift in her attention, the visible, absolute weight of her focus turning fully toward the assembled factions, proved more effective than any offensive working the night had yet produced. Cao Cao's forces withdrawing with careful, measured haste, the old Satan faction's scattered remnants fleeing outright, and the Grigori hardliners' cold, contemptuous composure finally, thoroughly broken as his own forces retreated in open, undisguised alarm. Within minutes, the battlefield that had, moments earlier, hosted three factions' worth of converging violence, stood empty of every threat but the exhausted, battle-worn defenders who remained. The silence that followed carried its own particular weight, not the tense, held-breath quiet of danger still lingering, but the heavy, exhausted stillness of a genuine ending, hard-won and costly, in ways that would take considerable time to fully reckon. Miroku, breathing hard, lowered his cracked staff slowly, Sango already at his side, checking him over with fierce, unhidden worry, despite his reassurances that the worst of Cao Cao's assault had left him bruised rather than seriously wounded. Inuyasha stood amid the scorched wreckage of the old Satan faction's broken formation, Tessaiga still drawn, golden eyes scanning the clearing for any lingering threat with the wary, unrelaxed instinct of a fighter who had learned, the hard way, never to assume a battle's ending was truly final. Rias, exhausted and battle-worn but unmistakably, fiercely relieved, gathered her peerage close, checking each of them over with the same careful attention Sango had shown Miroku. Ophis remained a moment longer, studying the assembled, exhausted defenders with the same unhurried, ancient curiosity that had characterized every interaction she'd offered them thus far. "You'll face this again," she said finally, to Kagome directly. "Cao Cao does not abandon ambitions easily. The old Satan faction's grievance runs deeper than tonight's failure will heal. And there are others in this world who will hear what happened here tonight and draw their own conclusions about what your jewel might be worth to them." Her gray eyes carried something that might, on a being capable of genuine warmth, have passed for a kind of distant, ancient respect. But you chose the quieter path again tonight, even when the louder one would have ended the fight faster. I find that worth continuing to watch." She was gone a moment later, as unhurriedly and inexplicably as she'd arrived, leaving behind a battlefield finally, genuinely settling into the exhausted quiet of a fight that had, against considerable odds, ended without the catastrophic cost it had threatened. It took the better part of the following week for the region to fully settle, Surzek's formal office dispatching envoys to assess the damage and negotiate, through exhausting diplomatic channels, a renewed set of boundaries meant to discourage any future coordinated assault of the kind that had nearly succeeded. The old Satan factions exposed remnants, their resources and standing considerably diminished by the battle's costly failure, retreated into a silence that, for the first time since the Jewel's arrival, carried the genuine weight of a threat finally, meaningfully contained, rather than merely delayed. Cao Cao's hero faction, its betrayal of temporary allies now a matter of open, uncomfortable record across the Khaos Brigade's fractious coalition, found its standing among its own uneasy partners considerably weakened. A cost, Azazel noted with grim satisfaction, that Cao Cao's careful, patient ambition would take considerable time to recover from. And in the quiet, exhausted aftermath, gathered once more in the occult research clubroom's warm, familiar light, the family that had fallen through a tear between worlds finally, properly reckoned with exactly what the night had cost, and exactly what it had confirmed. "We're not going home yet," Kagome said quietly, into the room's tired, thoughtful silence. "Are we? The well's still unstable. We don't actually know if it'll ever open again the way it used to." "No," Miroku agreed, gentle despite the weight of the admission. "We don't know that yet." He glanced around the room, at Rias, exhausted but steady beside her peerage, at Sango, her hand still tight in his despite the battle's ending, at Shippo, curled close against Kaneko's side, both of them finally, quietly asleep after a night considerably harder than either child should have had to survive. But I find, watching this family we've built here these past weeks, that I'm considerably less afraid of that uncertainty than I was the night we first fell through. Rias, watching the same quiet, exhausted scene with her own hard-won, genuine warmth, finally spoke the thought that had clearly been building in her since the battle's ending. "Whatever happens with the well," she said, "however long it takes to find your way home, or to determine that this is simply where you're meant to be for now, you have a place here, not as guests, not as a threat to be managed or a prize to be protected." Her eyes, steady and certain, swept the room. "As family, for as long as you need it to be true." Kagome's answering smile, tired but genuine, carried the particular hard-won warmth of someone who had, against every reasonable expectation, found in an impossible world exactly the kind of chosen, unbreakable family she'd feared she might never build again, outside the one she'd left behind. "Family," she said. "Yeah, I think we'd like that." Outside the clubroom's warm windows, dawn finally broke over a Kuo academy that had, in the space of little more than a month, quietly become something considerably more than a strange temporary refuge. And somewhere far beyond the edge of its careful, hard-won peace, the wider supernatural world continued turning, considerably more aware now of 6 travelers and the jewel they'd chosen, again and again, not to weaponize, than it had been the night a well tore open onto a world it had never expected to hold. The Shikon no Tama never stopped glowing faintly warm against Kagome's throat, not in all the weeks that followed. A quiet, constant reminder of a choice renewed daily rather than settled once and left behind. The well, when Shemhazai's instruments finally mapped its stabilized, half-open state properly, offered no promises about when or whether it would fully reopen, only a faint, persistent thread of possibility that Kagome chose, deliberately, to treat as hope rather than grief. What the 6 travelers found instead, in a world that had first measured them by rank and threat and prize, was something none of them had expected to build twice in one lifetime. A family widened rather than replaced. Rias's peerage folding into their strange, hard-won circle, with the same unhurried, earned trust that had carried the original 6 through 5 years of impossible odds. Kaneko's fierce, quiet loyalty to Shippo, Sango and Kiba's steady, wordless understanding, Asia and Kagome's shared, hard-won conviction that a gift meant to help was never a corruption, whatever the world first assumed. Miroku and Rias's mutual, careful respect, forged in honesty rather than obligation. Inuyasha and Vali's honest, hard-fought rivalry, the rare gift of an opponent who wanted nothing from him but truth. Cao Cao's ambition did not end that night, and neither did the old grievances still smoldering in the underworld's forgotten corners, nor the wider Khaos Brigade's fractured, watching interest in an artifact that had, against every expectation, refused to become anyone's weapon. But for the first time since the well had torn open onto a world they'd never asked to enter, the family that had fallen through it stood together not as strangers weighing an unfamiliar battlefield, but as something the world's measuring, ranking systems had never quite managed to categorize. Not a threat, not a prize, not a peerage bound by contract. Simply, stubbornly, a family who had chosen each other, and chosen, again and again, the quieter and harder path of refusing to let anyone else's hunger decide what their power was for. Whatever came next, and something, inevitably, always did, they intended to face it exactly the way they'd faced everything since the day the sky first tore open above a quiet clearing outside Quo. Together, unbroken, and entirely on their own terms.